She was 23 years old, alone in Montana territory, about to marry a man she had never met. The whole town said he had killed 4 men with his bare hands. What they did not tell her was that another man in a black broadcloth coat had already paid a Boston lender to have her delivered to his door, and he had murdered a woman behind that same cabin 12 years before. This is the story of Harriet Whitlock in the day she stepped off a stagecoach into a war that had been burning for 3 decades before her name ever reached the Bitterroot. The stagecoach rolled to a stop in a cloud of October dust, and Harriet Whitlock stepped down into nothing. No husband waited on the platform. No house stood anywhere within sight. Just a dirt street cut between a dozen weathered buildings, a saloon with broken shutters, a general store with a crooked sign, and beyond it all, the wilderness rolling away in every direction toward mountains that looked like the edge of the world. The wind carried the smell of horse manure and wood smoke, and something colder, still the breath of winter coming down from the Bitterroot Peaks. Harriet stood with her small leather valise clutched against her chest. She was 23 years old. She had traveled 1,500 miles on that railroad and another 40 on this rattling stage, and now she had arrived at Silver Creek, Montana territory, and the letter had lied. The letter had promised a home. It had not promised 3 bearded mountain men standing beside a freight wagon watching her the way wolves watch a deer that has wandered too far from the herd. She did not know that this was the day her old life ended. She did not know that the man who had paid for her passage carried the kind of reputation that made women cross themselves when they heard his name. She did not know about the grave behind the cabin, or the woman who had been murdered there 12 years before, or the reason a man named Royce Mallory was already watching her from the shadow of the hotel porch across the street. She did not know any of it. All she knew was that she had chosen this path and there was no way back. Before we go any further, friend, if you are new to the channel, take a moment and hit that subscribe button. I share frontier stories like this one every week, tales of brave women and harder men built on the bones of the American West. And tell me in the comments where you are listening from tonight. It helps more than you know. Now let me tell you how Harriet Whitlock came to be standing in that dirt street and what happened next. 3 months earlier, she had sat at a small writing desk in a boarding house on Beacon Street in Boston, and she had made a decision that would change the entire course of her life. Her father had been buried 3 weeks before. Edmund Whitlock had been a bookkeeper for a shipping firm on Long Wharf, a thin, quiet man who had read scripture every evening and corrected his daughter's Latin grammar with the same gentle patience he had used to teach her to play the piano. He had been a good man, a decent man, and in his final years as tuberculosis hollowed him out a cough, at a time he had borrowed money from a lender named Horace Finch to pay for medicines that never worked, and doctors who never came back twice. $800. That was the debt Harriet had inherited along with her father's pocket watch and his worn copy of the Psalms. Horace Finch was 55 years old. He had buried 3 wives. His house servants wore long sleeves in summer to cover what he did to them when he drank. He had come to the wake with oily sympathy and a pale blue proposal, and he had told Harriet quite clearly that she could marry him and see her father's debt forgiven, or she could be dragged before a magistrate and see everything her family had ever owned put to auction. Her younger brother Silas was 12 years old. He was all she had left in the world. He was staying at St. Vincent's orphanage while Harriet decided what came next, and St. Vincent's would not keep him forever without payment. Harriet had lain awake at night counting her choices, and there were only 3. She could marry Horace Finch and destroy herself to save her brother. She could take a position as a housemaid somewhere along Beacon Hill, send Silas to a workhouse school, and lose him to the kind of grinding poverty that ate boys alive before they turned 15. Or she could answer the advertisement that had been clipped into the matrimonial agency pamphlet her landlady had brought home from the post office. She remembered her father's last words whispered through lips, stained with the blood he had been coughing up for months. Hattie, he had said, "Keep your dignity. Protect your brother. Do not let circumstance decide for you. You decide for yourself." On a gray morning in early August, Harriet had opened the pamphlet and read the advertisement again, and she had taken out her pen. The reply had come 7 weeks later. It was written on plain brown paper in a man's hand. Blunt letters, no flourishes, no unnecessary words. Miss Whitlock, it began. I am not a gentleman. I live in the mountains of Montana Territory with my two brothers. We need a woman who can read, cook, and keep a house. I have enclosed $1,000. 800 will clear your debt. 200 will settle your brother in a boarding school of your choosing. I will never touch you against your will. That is the word of a Ravenscroft man. If you agree, the agency will arrange your passage. Gideon Ravenscroft. Harriet had read the letter 4 times. She had stared at the signature until the name burned itself into her mind. That is the word of a Ravenscroft man. She did not know what a Ravenscroft man was. She did not know whether it was a reassurance or a warning, but she recognized something in the letter that she had not felt in any of the polite smiles and greased proposals she had received since her father's death. She recognized honesty, a blunt instrument of a letter cutting through ornament, telling her the truth as the writer knew it. I decide for myself, she had whispered, and she had taken up her pen once more. The train west was 5 days of coal smoke and strangers. Silas had been sent ahead to Chicago with the money for his schooling tucked into a sealed envelope carried by a Methodist minister the agency vouched for. Harriet had kissed her brother on the forehead at the Boston station and told him she would write every week until the day he could come to her for Christmas. He had cried without shame, and she had not let herself cry until the train was well out of the harbor city and pulling through the Berkshires under a sky the color of slate. On the second day, a heavy-set widow named Prudence Gallagher had taken the seat beside her. The woman smelled of lavender water and rosary beads. She was going to join her nephew in Bozeman, and she had strong opinions about everything, particularly about the kind of men who sent away for mail-order brides. When Harriet, too tired to be careful, had let slip the name Ravenscroft of Silver Creek, the widow's face had gone as white as a candle flame. Dear child, Prudence Gallagher had whispered, her fingers tightening around the cross at her throat. Do you know who the Ravenscrofts are? Gideon Ravenscroft killed 4 men in a brawl at the silver mine in Helena. Broke a man's neck with his bare hands, they say. The middle one, Ezra, they say he runs with wolves. Goes weeks into the woods alone. Some of the trappers have heard him howling with them at night. And the youngest, Jasper, well, he has a softer face but the eyes child. The eyes of a boy who has watched too many funerals. Harriet had sat very still as the train jostled them both. She had pressed her gloved hands flat against her skirt so Prudence Gallagher would not see them shake. I decide for myself, she had thought. I chose this. Silas is safe. The debt is cleared. I chose this. She had looked out the window at the great rolling plains passing by, and she had told herself a story about dignity, about keeping her chin up, about what her father would have wanted. But under it all, there had been a whisper of pure cold fear. And the whisper had said, what if the widow is right? What if the man waiting for me is a killer? Now she stood in the street in Silver Creek, and she looked at the 3 Ravenscroft brothers, and she understood why Prudence Gallagher had crossed herself. They were enormous. The one in the center had to be 6.5 feet tall. He wore a long oilskin coat the color of a storm cloud, and beneath the brim of a dark felt hat, she could see a face carved from weather in hard use. A scar ran through the left eyebrow, pale and old, running down along the cheek. His eyes, when they finally rose to meet hers, were the color of amber held up to candlelight, and they did not warm when he looked at her. They measured her the way a carpenter measures a length of wood before he decides what to build with it. The second brother stood a half step behind. He was nearly as tall, with chestnut hair past his shoulders tied back with a leather cord. His eyes were a pale gray blue, so light they looked almost transparent, and his hands, folded over the wagon side rail, were scarred across every knuckle. He did not look at Harriet the way the first one did. He did not look at her at all. His gaze moved along the street, along the rooftops, along the alley beside the saloon, checking the shadows the way a man checks them when he expects trouble from them. The third brother was the youngest. She could tell by the way he stood, half leaning against the wagon wheel, one thumb hooked through his belt. He was tall and broad, but there was still something boyish in the line of his jaw. His hair was a sun-streaked wheat color, and his eyes, when they found Harriet, were a warm honey brown, and they held something that was almost kindness. She felt herself breathing again, just barely, just because of those eyes. The tall one in the center stepped forward and removed his hat. The gesture was careful, almost formal, and entirely out of place with the rest of him. "You are Miss Whitlock," he said. His voice was low-measured, roughened by years of cold air and quiet. "I am Gideon Ravenscroft. These are my brothers, Ezra, Jasper." Ezra tipped his chin. Jasper took off his hat entirely, and he bowed his head in a way that might have been awkward in any other man, but managed somehow to look like respect. Gideon glanced up at the sky, and Harriet followed his look. A slate-gray wall was moving down from the north, eating the horizon. "We have to leave now," Gideon said. "Storm coming off the peaks. It is 4 hours to the cabin, and I want to be off the ridge road before dark." Harriet looked at the wagon, at the mountains, at the three men. Her mouth was dry as paper. "Of course," she said. Jasper stepped forward. He carried something draped across his arm, a long, heavy garment of thick brown wool. Without looking at her directly, he held it out. "This belonged to our mother," he said. "The cold up there is different than what you are used to. Please." Harriet stared at the coat. Then she looked up at him. There was color high in his cheeks, and he still would not quite meet her eye, as if he were apologizing for something. "Thank you," she said quietly. She slipped her arms into the sleeves. The coat was too large by half, and it smelled of cedar and old lavender of a woman long gone. Something in her chest cracked, a hairline fracture she did not have time to examine. She pulled the collar up against the wind and gripped the valise. Gideon took the valise from her hand without asking. His fingers, where they brushed hers through her glove, were cold as riverstone. Ezra swung up onto the driver's bench. Jasper offered her a hand up into the wagon's second seat, and then he climbed to the back to mind the supplies. Gideon did not get into the wagon. He mounted a black gelding that had been tied to the rail, a tall, angular animal with the kind of eyes Harriet had only ever seen on ex-cavalry horses, patient and wary at the same time. As the wagon lurched forward, Harriet looked one last time at the town of Silver Creek, and that was when she saw him. He was standing on the long hotel porch across the street. A man in a black broadcloth coat, 50 years old, perhaps clean-shaven with pale gray eyes, set in a face that was handsome in the way that certain snakes are beautiful. He did not move as the wagon rolled past. He simply watched her. His hand rested on the porch rail, his gold pinky ring catching the last of the afternoon light, and when the wagon drew even with him, he smiled a slow, small smile that did not touch his eyes. Harriet felt something crawl up at the back of her neck. She turned to ask Jasper who the man was, but it was Gideon riding alongside the wagon who had seen her look. He leaned toward Ezra on the bench and spoke low, but the wind carried just enough for Harriet to hear. "Mallory was there waiting," Gideon said. He knew she was coming. "This is going to move faster than we thought." Ezra nodded once, did not speak. His hand drifted. Harriet saw to the stock of the Sharps rifle propped against the footboard. The wagon rolled out of Silver Creek and onto the wagon track that climbed up out of the valley, and Harriet Whitlock had no idea she had just walked into a war that had been burning for 12 years in the mountains ahead. A woman lay buried behind a cabin she had never seen. 3 men she had never met would be willing to die for her before the week was out. She only knew that a stranger in a black coat had smiled at her, and the sight of him had made her colder than the wind coming down off the peaks. The track climbed. For the first hour, they rode in silence. The road wound up through lodgepole pine and spruce, the trees thickening as the elevation rose, their needles catching the first dry flakes of snow that the wind had begun to peel off the high country. The wagon bumped and creaked. The harness jingled. Ezra drove with his eyes never still moving from the road to the trees to the ridgeline above, a constant patient sweep of a man looking for threats. Harriet sat in her too large coat and watched her breath rise in front of her and tried not to think. About the man in the black coat, about the word Mallory, about the fact that she had now been in the company of these three strangers for nearly 2 hours and had exchanged perhaps 12 words with any of them. She decided finally to speak. "How far is it to your home, Mr. Ravenscroft?" she said. She had addressed the question generally, and it was Jasper in the back of the wagon who answered her. 42 miles from Silver Creek, ma'am. We have come maybe 8 so far. The last stretch is a switchback up the side of the ridge. It is slow going, but the cabin sits in a sheltered bowl just below the tree line. You will be warm tonight. I promise you that." Warm sounded like a miracle. "Thank you, Mr. Ravenscroft." "Jasper," he said quickly, "please." Mr. Ravenscroft was our father. She turned enough to see him. Jasper, the youngest, sitting among the supplies with a rolled canvas tarp at his back and his rifle laid across his knees. His honey-colored eyes met hers and flicked away, and the color came back into his cheeks. "Jasper," then she said, "I am Harriet, or Hattie if that suits you better." "Hattie," he repeated softly as if tasting the word. Gideon, riding alongside, said nothing. Ezra said nothing. But something in the air between the four of them shifted a fraction of an inch, the way ice begins to shift on a river weeks before anyone can hear it crack. The snow thickened. The light drained out of the sky. They climbed. It was full dark, and Harriet had almost stopped feeling her feet when the wagon crested a ridge and began to descend into a small sheltered bowl cradled between two shoulders of the mountain. And there in the black of the pines, she saw a single window lit with the warm orange of a lantern, and then the broader glow of firelight behind it. A cabin larger than she had expected, 2 stories of squared timber, with a deep porch and a stone chimney that exhaled a thick plume of wood smoke into the falling snow. A dog began to bark, a large dog by the sound of it. Then it came bounding out from under the porch, a shaggy gray hound with one ear up and one ear folded, and it ran straight past the wagon to circle Gideon's horse with its whole body wagging. "That is Ranger Jasper," said. "He will love you by morning. He loves everyone by morning." Harriet laughed, and the sound surprised her, a small, unfamiliar thing she had not made in weeks. The wagon stopped in front of the porch. Gideon swung down from the saddle before any of them had time to speak. He came around to her side of the wagon and stood looking up at her for a moment, the amber eyes steady, unreadable with the snow settling on the brim of his hat. He lifted his arms. "May I?" he said. It took her a second to understand that he was asking permission. "Yes," she said. His hands closed round her waist through the heavy wool of his mother's coat, and he lifted her down from the wagon as if she weighed nothing. He set her on her feet carefully as if he were placing something breakable, and then he stepped back a full pace and he inclined his head. "Welcome to the Bitterroot, Miss Whitlock." "Hattie," she said before she could think. The corner of his mouth moved. It was not quite a smile, but it was something. "Hattie," he said. Inside the cabin, Harriet stopped in the doorway and pressed one hand against her mouth. She did not know what she had expected. Some rough dirt-floored shelter, maybe. Bearskins and bones and the stink of unwashed men. That was the picture the widow on the train had painted, and that was the picture she had carried with her for 1,500 miles. What she saw instead was a home. The floors were of wide planked pine swept clean. A great stone fireplace took up most of the north wall, and a fire was burning in it, throwing warm light across a long trestle table of walnut 4 sturdy chairs, a sideboard, and shelves upon shelves of books. She saw Dickens. She saw a bound edition of Shakespeare. She saw a family Bible with a leather cover worn soft by generations of hands. A braided rag rug lay before the hearth, and 2 rocking chairs faced the fire, one clearly older than the other. And there against the far wall, catching the firelight on its polished rosewood case, stood a small upright piano. Harriet took a step toward it without meaning to. She reached out and laid her fingertips on the keys, feeling the ivory cool and familiar, a sensation out of her life, before everything ended. Behind her, Gideon spoke quietly. "It was my mother's." Ezra hauled it up the switchback on a sledge one spring. "It has not been properly played since she died. I had Doc Pemberton send a man up to tune it 2 weeks ago in case you could. The letter said you could. Harriet did not turn around. She could not yet because her eyes had filled and she would not let them see that not on her first night. I can play, she said. Her voice came out steady, which surprised her. Thank you. Gideon did not answer. She heard him set her valise down on the floor. She heard Ezra come in from the back with an armload of split wood and the heavy thump as he stacked it beside the hearth. She heard Jasper in the kitchen, lean to pumping water, the hiss of a kettle going on over the stove. She turned around and the three of them were standing in a loose half circle, watching her. Three large men, each one of them the size of two ordinary men waiting to see what she did. Ranger sat at Jasper's heel tail, thumping the floor. Gideon cleared his throat. Miss Whitlock, Hattie, I said some things by letter, and I will say them again now so that we all start where we should. The preacher, Reverend Whitfield, will come up Sunday. We will be married in this room if that is agreeable to you. Once that is done, you are my wife by law. But there are things you need to hear from my mouth before Sunday. Harriet drew a slow breath. She had been waiting for this. She had rehearsed her composure for it. Go on. My brothers and I share this cabin. We built it together. We work it together. There is no part of this homestead that does not belong to all three of us, and by tomorrow morning, there will be no part of it that does not belong to you as well. You are going to be the lady of a Ravenscroft house, and that means two brothers-in-law who will treat you as a sister from the first day. Ezra sleeps in the room off the kitchen. Jasper sleeps on a cot by the fire, tending it through the night, as is his way. There is a bedroom upstairs with a door that locks from the inside. That is your room until you decide otherwise. It is yours alone. Mine is across the landing. No man in this house will cross the threshold of your door without you asking him to. Not tonight, not after the wedding, not ever. That is the word of a Ravenscroft man. He said it plainly, the way a man says something he has already decided to die defending. Harriet looked at him, then at Ezra standing silent by the hearth, his gray-blue eyes on the fire. Then at Jasper, who ducked his head and busied his hands with the kettle, his ears red. She had come 1,500 miles prepared for the worst thing a woman could be handed. She had told herself she would endure it for Silas's sake, for the debt for her father's last wish. She had braced every part of herself for a man who would consider her a purchase. And instead, she had been handed a locked door. The tears she had been holding all day came up suddenly, and there was no stopping them. She turned her face away toward the fire, and she pressed the heel of her hand against her mouth, and she wept silently with shame and relief, and something else she could not yet name. None of them moved. None of them spoke. She heard Ranger whine once, and the soft shush of Jasper's hand on the dog's head quieting him. After a moment, Gideon said very quietly, I will go see to the horses. He walked past her to the door, his boots making almost no sound. Ezra gathered up another armload of wood and went out the back to the lean-to. Jasper busied himself at the stove, rattling a pot with exaggerated care, giving her the mercy of not being watched. Harriet stood in front of the fire in a dead woman's coat, and she cried without letting anyone see her face. And for the first time since her father's funeral, the crying did not feel like an ending. It felt like something letting go. Outside in the barn, Gideon Ravenscroft stood in the warm animal dark beside his horse, and he pressed his forehead against the gelding's neck, and he closed his eyes. He had read her letter a dozen times. He had read between the lines of it for evidence of the woman behind the neat, careful script. He had tried to prepare himself for a stranger arriving in his house, a Boston girl with soft hands and no idea what a Montana winter was. He had braced himself for her disappointment, her fear, her contempt. He had not braced himself for the look on her face when he told her about the door that locked from the inside. He had not braced himself for the way she had stood in front of his mother's piano and laid her fingertips on the keys as if it were a grave. He had not braced himself for the way she had said, before she could think, call me Hattie. Gideon Ravenscroft had been a boy of 20 when his mother died. He had been a man of 24 when he buried the last man who had heard her in a shallow trench outside the silver mine in Helena, and he had carried the weight of her grave and of those 4 graves up into these mountains 8 years ago, and he had thought the weight was the only thing that would ever belong to him now. The weight in the cabin and his two brothers and the long, patient work of keeping them alive. Now there was a woman in his mother's coat weeping in front of his mother's fire, and a man named Royce Mallory in a black broadcloth coat was down in Silver Creek making his plans. A killer in the hills, Prudence Gallagher, had whispered on the train, a man who could kill with his bare hands. What Prudence Gallagher did not know, and what nobody in the town of Silver Creek fully understood, was how few of the men Gideon Ravenscroft had killed had deserved to live, and how much of his soul he had spent doing it. He had promised himself on the night he came up into these mountains with his brothers that he would not spend any more of it. That the killing was done, he had not counted on Royce Mallory reaching for something new. He had not counted on a letter from a 23-year-old widow's daughter in Boston. He lifted his head and he whispered into the horse's mane words that were not quite a prayer because Gideon Ravenscroft did not feel entitled to pray any longer. "Mama," he said, "I am going to protect this one, no matter what it costs. That is my word. That is a Ravenscroft man's word." The wind howled over the roof of the barn, and the snow thickened, and somewhere down in the valley, 42 miles away, by wagon track, a man in a black broadcloth coat sat in the parlor of his 8-bedroom house with a glass of whiskey in his hand, reading a telegram that had come up from Boston an hour before. The telegram confirmed that the Whitlock girl had left the train at the transfer in Ogden as expected, that she had boarded the stage for Silver Creek, that she had arrived, that she had been taken. Royce Mallory set the telegram down and smiled into his whiskey. 30 years he had waited. 30 years since Margaret Rose O'Donnell had laughed in his face and married a man named Silas Ravenscroft instead. 12 years since he had put Margaret Rose in a grave behind a cabin up on the Bitterroot and gotten away with it clean. 10 years since he had driven her sons up into the peaks and called them killers in every saloon within 100 miles so that no one would believe them if they ever came back down. He had waited. He had built his empire. He had extended his hand across every debt in this valley. And now the oldest Ravenscroft boy had made a mistake. The oldest Ravenscroft boy had reached at last for something soft, something he could lose. Royce Mallory sipped his whiskey and he looked into the fire and he began slowly, patiently to plan how to take it from him. Back in the cabin, Harriet Whitlock had dried her face on the sleeve of her borrowed coat. Jasper had put a cup of coffee in her hands without fuss or comment, and the three brothers had sat down with her at the long walnut table, and nobody had said anything about her tears. They ate a supper of elk stew and cornbread and fresh butter. Nobody said much. The fire cracked. Ranger laid his chin on Harriet's boot under the table and sighed a great contented sigh, and Harriet felt something inside her that had been clenched tight for 3 years slowly, cautiously begin to unclench. When the meal was finished, Gideon stood. "I will take your trunk upstairs, Hattie. I imagine you are ready to sleep." She nodded. He went out to the wagon to bring in her things, and as he passed through the door, she saw him just for a second look back at her from the threshold. The firelight caught his face and the amber eyes held hers, and something passed between them that was too small to name and too big to ignore. Then he was gone into the snow, and the door closed behind him, and she was left in the warm room with Ezra silently mending a harness by the fire, and Jasper carefully washing the dishes and the boy snoring at her feet. She looked around the cabin, at the piano, at the books, at the hand-sewn rag rug, at the 1,000 small signs of a woman who had once made this a home and had been taken from it too soon. She did not yet know the woman's name. She did not yet know that she was sitting in the chair that woman had once sat in, eating from the plates that woman had once set, warming herself at the fire that woman had once tended. All she knew sitting in that fire-lit room on her first night in Montana was that she was tired down to her bones and that she was warm, and that for the first time since her father had died, she was not afraid. She did not know it yet, but she had come home. And out in the barn, a man who had sworn off killing was oiling his old army Colt by lantern light and checking the action and laying it gently back into its holster and preparing in his quiet, unhurried way to do whatever he had to do to keep her. Harriet Whitlock woke before dawn in a bed that smelled of cedar and sun-dried linen, and for a long moment she did not remember where she was. The ceiling above her was exposed beam, dark with age, the kind of honest carpentry that did not pretend to be anything other than what it was. A small iron stove in the corner had been banked low through the night, and someone had crept up the stairs at some point, and added wood to it without waking her because the room was warm. A white enamel pitcher and basin sat on a washstand by the window. A braided rug lay on the plank floor beside the bed in blues and creams and the soft rows of dried flower petals. On the nightstand she saw small leather-bound journals and a fresh pen set out as if the room had been waiting for her. She sat up slowly. The house below was silent except for the muted crackle of the fire and the low rumble of a man's voice speaking to someone she could not hear. Then a quiet laugh. Jasper, she thought. She could already recognize the cadence of the youngest brother, his voice shaped by warmth even when she could not hear the words. She rose, washed her face in the cold water from the pitcher, and dressed in her plainest wool dress, a deep forest green with a high collar. She braided her hair and pinned it in a loose crown. She looked at herself in the small oval mirror above the washstand and found to her surprise that the woman looking back at her did not look as frightened as she had expected to feel. She descended the stairs. The kitchen smelled of coffee and bacon, and something sweeter beneath it, a hint of honey. Jasper stood at the iron stove with his back to her, his broad shoulders filling out a blue flannel shirt, a wooden spoon in his large hand as he stirred a pot of oatmeal. The early light through the window caught the wheat-colored fall of his hair. Ranger lay by the hearth, and when he saw Harriet on the stairs, his tail thumped hard against the floor, and Jasper turned. "Good morning, Hattie." The color came up in his cheeks the moment he said her name. "I did not know if you took your oats plain or sweet. Mama always liked hers with honey from the old pine hive out back. I left the honey in a small jar on the table in case you wanted some. And there is bacon and coffee, and I can make you an egg if you want. We have 5 hens." He said it all at once a little too quickly, and then he stopped, and the color in his cheeks deepened. Harriet smiled. She could not help it. "Honey, please," she said, "and an egg. Thank you, Jasper." He turned back to the stove as if she had given him a commission of state. "Where are your brothers?" she asked. Gid went out before first light, checking the cattle up on the south meadow. He said the storm pushed some of the herd into a draw, and he wanted to count noses before the wind turned. "Ezra is in the barn fixing the hinge on the east door. It tore loose in the wind last night. He said you might hear him cussing and not to mind it." Harriet laughed again, and this morning the laugh came easier than the night before. "I shall try to be scandalized," she said. Jasper grinned down at his oatmeal. She sat at the long walnut table, and Jasper set a plate in front of her and a chipped blue cup full of coffee that was strong enough to stand a spoon in, and she ate the first real breakfast she had eaten since her father had fallen ill 3 years before. The oatmeal with its dark wild honey, the bacon crisped at the edges, the fried egg. Ranger laid his head against her knee under the table, and she slipped him a piece of crust, and Jasper, without looking, said quietly, "Mama used to feed him off her plate, too. That dog will love you forever now." Mama, the word he used without meaning to tell her anything by it, and yet it told her everything. The coat she had been given, the piano tuned for her, the room prepared, the journal on the nightstand, the way Jasper spoke of his mother in the present tense, as if she had only stepped out to the clothesline and would be back in a moment. These men had been waiting, she realized, for a woman to come into this cabin again. Not as a servant, not as property, but as a presence that filled the empty space their mother had left. They had not been able to say it to themselves in so many words, but the house had been saying it for 12 years. She set her spoon down carefully. "Jasper," she said, "will you teach me what I need to know? How to keep this house properly? I do not want to be a burden. I want to be of use." He turned from the stove and looked at her, and for a long moment he did not speak. When he did, his voice was softer than the fire. Hattie, he said, you are not a burden. You are the first good thing that has walked into this house in a long, long time. But yes, I will teach you everything I know. I can show you the milk cow this morning if you want. Her name is Bessie. She is an old Jersey and she has her moods. But once she likes you, she is the gentlest thing in the county. They went out to the barn after breakfast. The wind had dropped in the night and the world was blanketed in a clean skin of new snow that glittered in the rising sun. The mountains above the cabin stood so close and so tall that Harriet stopped in the yard and simply looked up at them, her breath rising in a plume, her boots crunching on a world she could not yet believe she was standing in. She had seen the ocean from Boston wharves. She had seen the Berkshires from a train window. She had not seen anything like this. A country that looked at you and did not care whether you lived or died, and somehow that indifference made her feel for the first time that she was truly and completely alive. The barn was warm with the slow heat of animal bodies, 4 horses in their stalls, the big black gelding of Gideon's, a bay mare, a sorrel, and a rough-coated mountain pony that Jasper said was Ezra's favorite for work in deep timber. And there in her own stall, a small, honey-colored Jersey cow with great dark eyes. This is Bessie, Jasper said. Bessie, meet Hattie. Be kind to her, old girl. He showed her how to tie her hair back, how to wash the udder with warm water from a bucket, how to sit on the low 3-legged stool and lean her head against the warm flank of the cow. The first time Harriet tried, no milk came at all. The second time, a thin spurt hit her square in the cheek, and Jasper burst out laughing before he could stop himself. He clapped a hand over his mouth and then laughed harder at his own failure to contain it, and Harriet, wiping warm milk off her face with her sleeve, laughed too. Gentle but firm, Hattie, he said, like anything worth doing. She tried again, and this time a steady, thin stream of milk rang against the side of the pail. Something lifted in her chest. She had not known she'd been waiting all of her life to milk a cow. She had not known how much she had needed to be good at something with her hands. When she carried the pail back toward the cabin, balanced carefully in both gloved hands, she looked up and saw Ezra standing in the doorway of the barn's east wing, his rifle propped against the jamb, a hammer in his hand. He had watched the whole lesson without saying a word, a still shape in the morning light. When her eyes met his, he inclined his head, just a fraction, the smallest possible acknowledgement. Good morning, Mr. Ravenscroft, she called. Ezra, he corrected quietly. Just Ezra. Good morning, Ezra. He nodded once more and turned back into the barn. The hammer began again against the hinge, but she had seen something in those pale gray blue eyes before he looked away. A quiet approval. The look a man gives a stranger when she has done a small thing correctly, and he has decided, without saying so, to take her seriously. The days began to pass. On the 3rd day, Gideon came back to the cabin at dusk with his leather gloves off and his hands caked in dried blood. A bramble field had snagged one of the Herefords down in a steep draw, and he had gone in on foot to cut the beast loose, and the thorns had done their work on his own hands and forearms as the panicked cow had thrashed. Jasper was up at the North Spring repairing the pipe that carried water into the kitchen. Ezra was somewhere in the high timber tracking a wolf that had been circling the herd. Gideon had come home to an empty room, and when he pushed through the door, he stopped short at the sight of Harriet standing at the kitchen table with a basket of eggs because he had forgotten for a moment that she was there. He tried to move past her toward the wash basin. She stopped him with a look. Sit down, she said. He hesitated. Mr. Ravenscroft. Sit. He sat. She brought over a shallow tin bowl of water. She set to heat on the stove, clean folded linen, her mother's small sewing kit, and a half-full jar of the wild pine honey from Jasper's shelf. She rolled his sleeves back to the elbow without asking permission. His forearms were a road map of old scars, some from work, some from something harder. She tried not to look at them long enough to think. This will sting, she said. It did. She cleaned the long, shallow slashes with the hot water, pinched one of the deepest together between her thumb and forefinger, and set 2 tiny, careful stitches with a thread she had drawn through a flame. She finished each wound with a dab of honey because her mother had sworn by honey for wounds that wanted to fester, and she bound each arm with strips of clean linen. He did not flinch once. He did not speak. He watched her work with his jaw set and his amber eyes steady on her face as if she were the thing he had to brace himself against, not the pain. When she was done, she tied off the last bandage and stepped back. "Thank you, Miss Whitlock." "Hattie," she said. "Hattie," he said, and he did not look away from her as he said it. The fire cracked. Ranger snored against the hearthstone. Outside, the wind was picking up again, the blue of early evening creeping down from the peaks. "I was a nurse to my father," she said before she quite knew she was going to. "For 3 years. He had consumption. I learned. I am better with stitches than I am with oatmeal, probably." "Your father was a lucky man to have you," Gideon said quietly. Her throat closed. She looked down at the sewing kit to keep her face private, and she nodded once. On the 5th day, she woke to find a small wooden bird on the windowsill of her bedroom. It was carved from a pale, close-grained wood, perhaps pine, perhaps some mountain cedar she did not yet know the name of. Its wings were spread as if in mid-flight, each feather scored with a patience that must have taken hours. Its small head was tilted slightly as if listening. There was no note. There was no signature. It simply sat on the sill as if it had flown in and chosen the spot. She carried it downstairs in her cupped hands like a live thing. At the table, Ezra was eating breakfast in his silence, his hair still damp from washing at the basin. She set the bird down in front of him. He looked at it, then at her, then back at the bird. A faint flush crept up his weathered neck. "Thank you, Ezra," she said. "It is the loveliest thing anyone has ever given me." He ducked his head toward his coffee cup. "You are welcome, Hattie." And that was all he said. But for the rest of the morning, as he moved through the yard, splitting wood with his shirt sleeves rolled past his scarred forearms, she watched him from the kitchen window and saw once the ghost of a smile on his face when he thought no one was looking. Sunday came. Reverend Obadiah Whitfield rode up from Silver Creek on a long-eared mule in the iron-gray light of early afternoon, his Bible wrapped in oilcloth against the damp, his long white side whiskers catching the wind. Behind him on a patient farm horse came Winston Hollister, 65 years old, a Scotsman gone silver at the temples, with eyes the color of peat water, and a careful way of holding his shoulders as if he were still a younger man and had not yet noticed he was old. Beside him on a second horse rode his wife Cordelia in a dark wool traveling coat, her gray hair pinned back under a plain bonnet, her gloved hands folded with a tidy economy of a woman who had pioneered a country and did not waste motion on anything. They were the only witnesses Gideon had asked for. The nearest neighbors 6 miles south across a ridge who had known the Ravenscroft brothers since the oldest of them was 15 years old. The wedding was held in the main room of the cabin. Harriet wore the forest green wool dress, cleaned and brushed and pressed with a flat iron Jasper had heated on the stove for her. Cordelia Hollister had brought a small spray of dried wildflowers from her own kitchen window and had pinned them into Harriet's hair without asking, clicking her tongue softly as she worked. There now, Cordelia had said, "A bride ought to have flowers, and if the good Lord sends her October, he sends her October flowers." Stand still, lass. Gideon wore a clean white shirt and a black waistcoat that had belonged to his father. He had shaved. The line of the old scar through his left eyebrow was visible in the firelight, and Harriet discovered standing across from him, with her small, cold hands folded against her skirt, that the scar had stopped frightening her some days ago, and she had not even noticed when. Reverend Whitfield read the words. Gideon said, "I will," with a voice gone a little rough. Harriet said, "I do," in a voice that did not shake. And when Reverend Whitfield said, "You may kiss the bride," Gideon Ravenscroft, 6.5 feet of him, who had killed 4 men in a silver mine brawl, and buried his mother in the ground behind this cabin, bent his head with infinite care and pressed a single gentle kiss to Harriet's forehead. "We have time," he whispered, so quiet that only she could hear. Cordelia Hollister let out a small sound that might have been a sob and might have been a laugh, and was probably both. Winston Hollister cleared his throat and clapped Gideon hard on the shoulder and said in his soft Highland burr, "Well now, lad, well now." Ezra stood at the back of the room, hands folded, and said nothing. Jasper, standing next to the piano with Ranger at his heel, had tears on his young face and was not ashamed of them. Afterward, Cordelia Hollister drew Harriet aside into the kitchen under the pretense of helping with the pot of venison stew that was simmering on the stove. The old woman laid her thin, strong hand on Harriet's arm and held her eyes with a steady, peat-water gaze. "I knew their mother," she said quietly. "Margaret Rose, the best friend I ever had in this country. She was a sharp, clever Irish girl who came out here as a young bride and carved a life out of this mountain with her bare hands. She raised those 3 boys to be good men. The world has said otherwise about them, child, because the world is cruel and forgetful and fond of a lie. But I am telling you the truth now, and you must listen. These 3 men will never raise a hand to you. They will bleed themselves dry to keep you. Give them time, Hattie. They will give you their whole hearts before the year is out." Harriet could not speak. She could only nod. Cordelia patted her cheek and turned back to the stew with a brisk efficiency as if nothing had been said at all. That night, after the Hollisters and the Reverend had ridden back down the ridge, Harriet sat at the walnut table with a fresh sheet of paper and a pen, and she wrote the first of many letters she would send to her brother Silas at the Chicago boarding school. She told him about the mountain, about Ranger the dog, about the piano that had not been played in 12 years and was being played again now. She did not tell him about Mallory. She did not yet know enough to tell him about Mallory. But she did tell him at the end of the letter that for the first time since their father had died, she believed she had found a place where she could wait for him to grow up. "Come at Christmas if the brothers will have you," she wrote. "I believe they will. Gideon has already asked." She folded the letter and sealed it, and she laid it on the mantel to be carried down to the Silver Creek post the next time one of the brothers made the ride. On the 8th night, the first true storm came down off the peaks. The wind began to rise at dusk, a low moan in the eaves that deepened within an hour into a full scream. Snow drove sideways against the window glass. Ranger pressed himself under the kitchen table and refused to come out. At 9 o'clock, Gideon stood up from his chair and said quietly, "The east rail fence is going to go, boys." Ezra was already on his feet. Jasper reached for his coat. "We have to try to brace it tonight, or we will lose a dozen calves to wolves by morning," Gideon said. He turned to Harriet. "Stay in the house. Keep the fire up. Bolt the door when we leave." They went out into the storm. Harriet stood at the window for 10 minutes, watching the bobbing pinprick of a lantern move through the dark toward the east pasture and then disappear entirely into the blowing snow. She could hear nothing but wind. She could see nothing but white. The fire popped. Ranger whined. She could not stand it. She wrapped herself in Margaret Rose Ravenscroft's brown wool coat. She found a heavy canvas basket and filled it with a pot of hot coffee sealed under a cloth, 3 tin mugs, a half loaf of the bread she had baked that morning, and the butt end of a smoked ham. She lit a second lantern. She tied a scarf over her hair and bound it under her chin. She bolted the door behind her from the outside and walked into the storm. The wind drove her sideways 3 steps for every 2 she took forward. The snow was already past her ankles and in some drifts past her knees. The cold burned in her lungs. The lantern swung in her gloved hand and cast a small yellow circle that illuminated almost nothing, but she knew the direction of the east pasture because she had walked out to it with Jasper only 2 mornings before to look at the winter calves, and she followed the line of the fence with her shoulder brushing the top rail whenever the drifts led her. She came around the corner of the long, low barn and saw them. 3 tall shapes stooped over a length of broken rail, struggling against the wind, a pair of lanterns hooked onto the fence post beside them, and the dark moving bodies of a dozen cattle bunched against the sheltered side of the barn. She saw Ezra lift a heavy post into place. She saw Jasper bracing the far end. She saw Gideon swinging a sledge, driving a wooden peg down into the frozen ground with the full weight of his shoulder. She staggered the last 10 yards through a drift, the basket banging against her hip, and she set the lantern down on the nearest fence post with a bang loud enough to carry above the wind. 3 heads snapped up. "You idiots," she shouted over the wind. "You forgot to eat." For a moment, they just stared at her, 3 tall men frozen in mid-work snow piled on their hats, ice in their beards. Then Ezra, silent Ezra, Ezra who had not laughed in her presence once since she had set foot in Montana. Ezra turned his head away and made a sound that was very close to a laugh. Jasper straight out roared. Gideon the sledge lowered slowly to his side, stared at her with an expression she could not read, his amber eyes catching the lantern light, and then one corner of his mouth pulled up, and he shook his head once slow as if he were surrendering to something. "Hattie," he said, "you are going to freeze to death." "So eat fast," she shouted back. They retreated to the lee side of the barn and hunched out of the worst of the wind, and she poured coffee into the tin cups with hands she could not feel anymore. She tore bread. She handed chunks of smoked ham to each of them. Jasper took his food without meeting her eyes because he was laughing too hard. Ezra took his with a grave nod and ate as if he had not eaten in a week. Gideon took his cup last, and as his fingers closed around the tin, their gloved hands brushed, and he held on a beat longer than was necessary. "Thank you," he said. She nodded. 4 of them, huddled against the wall of a barn in the worst storm of the early winter. The cattle pressed against the far side, the wind tearing at everything. And Harriet Whitlock, who had stepped off a stagecoach 9 days ago into nothing, stood inside the circle of these 3 men and understood with a small, sharp clarity that she belonged somewhere for the first time in her adult life. She did not say it, but she did not need to. Gideon, when he drained his coffee cup and handed it back to her, looked at her over the rim with something in his amber eyes that she had not seen there before. "Go back to the cabin, Hattie," he said softly. "We will not be long." She went. That night, 2 hours before dawn, she lay in her bed upstairs and could not sleep. She kept seeing Gideon's face in the lantern light. She kept feeling the press of his gloved fingers against hers when he took the cup. Finally, she rose, wrapped herself in her heaviest shawl, and came downstairs on bare feet. Gideon was sitting alone before the fire in his rocking chair, one hand around a cut-glass tumbler of whiskey staring into the flames. He had washed and changed his dark hair, still damp against his collar. He did not turn his head when she came down, but he knew her tread because he said, without looking up, "You should be asleep. So should you." She sat in the other rocking chair. Ranger on the rug between them thumped his tail once and then stilled. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The fire cracked. The wind had died. "I thought," she said finally, "that when I stepped off that stage, I was walking into the worst day of my life. I had spent 5 days on the train preparing myself for it. I had told myself over and over that I would endure whatever was waiting for my brother, for my debt, for my father's memory." Gideon turned his head slowly to look at her. "And now," she said, "sitting here, in this room, in your mother's coat, I find that I cannot quite remember how to be afraid." He was quiet for a long time. Then he set the tumbler down on the hearth and leaned forward with his forearms on his knees. His large, scarred hands clasped his eyes on the fire. "I was 20 years old," he said, "in the spring of '66 when my father died. I was the oldest. Jasper was a boy of 15. Ezra was 18. My mother was pregnant with a late child she had not expected, and she had no husband anymore. And she had 3 sons who did not know yet how to run a ranch without the man who had built it." Harriet held very still. "There was a man in Silver Creek," Gideon said, "who had loved my mother years ago, back when she was young and newly come to Denver from County Cork. She had laughed in his face and married my father instead. He had never forgiven it. He had grown rich in this valley, while my father had built his life up on this mountain. And when my father died, he rode up here to our door and offered to buy our land for a pittance. My mother threw him off the porch with a shotgun in her hands and a baby in her belly, and she told him to go to hell. He paused. His knuckles had gone white around each other. 3 months later, the three of us rode down to Helena to buy medicine in winter flower. My mother had been having trouble with the pregnancy. We were gone one night only. When we came back, there were 2 sets of wagon tracks in the snow leading up from the valley and back down. My mother was in her bed in the last hour of her labor. She had been in labor alone for most of a day. The baby was turned wrong. Mama and the baby both died before sundown on the day we came home. Harriet's hand rose to her mouth. We could never prove what had happened. We knew the tracks were his wagon. But by the time we had buried them and tried to find him, the snow had come and covered everything, and the sheriff at that time was in his pocket. And so we did what men in this country have always done when the law is useless. We waited. Gideon's voice had gone flat and quiet. The voice of a man reading aloud from a ledger of old debts. A year later, I found one of his men in a saloon in Helena, drunk, bragging about what they had done that night. I killed him with my hands. 2 of his friends tried to stop me. They did not. 4 men. That is the number you will hear from anyone in this territory who mentions my name. What they will not tell you is who those men were or what they were bragging about. He finally turned to look at her. His amber eyes were bright and level and entirely without self-pity. I am not a good man, Hattie. I have spent the last 8 years up on this mountain trying not to become any worse. But you are sitting in my house wearing my mother's coat, and you deserve to know whose house you are sitting in before you go any further. Harriet rose from her chair without thinking about it. She crossed the 2 steps that separated them. She knelt on the rug in front of him, and she laid her hand over his clasped hands, and she looked up into his face. Gideon, she said softly, a man who spends 8 years trying not to become worse is not the same thing as a man who is bad. You made a choice after that night, and you kept making it every morning since. That is what a good man is. That is all a good man ever is. His throat worked. He did not speak, but he slowly uncurled his fingers from their fist, and he turned his hand over, and his palm, rough and scarred and warm, closed around hers. They sat like that, her hand in his, for a long time while the fire sighed and Ranger dreamed at their feet. That night, for the first time since she had arrived in the cabin on the Bitterroot, Harriet Whitlock went back up the stairs to her bedroom, and she did not bolt the door. She left it open, a hand's width. She did not know herself quite what it meant, but in the morning she would find on her windowsill beside the little wooden bird a single sprig of dried lavender tied with a length of brown string, and she would understand that at least one of the Ravenscroft brothers had passed her door in the dark hours and had seen. What she did not yet know, what none of them yet knew, was that 42 miles away, in a warm parlor in Silver Creek, Royce Mallory had just received a second telegram. And this one had come from a detective agency in Boston. And this one carried the name of a lender named Horace Finch, who had a grievance he had been carrying for nearly 4 months, and who was very willing to tell the agency anything Mallory wanted to know. Mallory read the telegram twice. He folded it into his breast pocket. He poured himself a fresh whiskey, and he smiled. The grave behind the cabin had waited 12 years, he thought. It could wait a little longer, but not much. Outside, the wind in the high country had gone quiet. The snow had stopped. Somewhere in the great dark above the cabin, an owl called once, and the sound carried clean and cold across 100 acres of pine. And in the open doorway of her bedroom on the 2nd floor, Harriet Whitlock slept. She had no way of knowing that she had stepped into a story already 30 years in the making. 3 small graves waited on a ridge behind the cabin, and the smallest of them had not yet been shown to her. And inside a box at the foot of Gideon's bed, folded carefully, lay a letter from a sheriff's hand, written 2 months before she had ever heard the name Ravenscroft, a letter that when she found it would nearly undo her. She only knew in her sleep that a door was open, and that for the first time in a long time, she was not afraid of what might come through it. The first morning after the storm, Harriet Whitlock came downstairs to a house that was somehow quieter than silence. The wind had died at some point in the deep of the night. When she opened the front door and stepped onto the porch with a shawl wrapped around her shoulders, the world lay under 3 feet of new snow, and the sun was just cresting the eastern ridge, setting the whole valley on fire. Every pine branch bent under its white burden. Every surface glittered. She stood barefoot on the cold boards of the porch and breathed in air so pure and so sharp it hurt her teeth, and she thought, I have never seen this much silence in one place in my whole life. She thought, I am not the same woman who stepped off that stagecoach 10 days ago. She did not yet know how much further she still had to go. Inside, the fire was high and the coffee was ready, but none of the brothers were in the main room. She pulled on her boots and her coat and went out the back door and followed the path that had been shoveled apparently in the last hour between the cabin and the woodshed. What she meant to do was fetch an armload of kindling. What she actually did was stop at the far corner of the shed, because beyond it, on the small level shelf of land that sat just behind the cabin, something caught her eye through the pines. A fence, a small wooden fence waist-high enclosing a square of snow. Inside the square, 3 dark shapes standing upright against the white. She walked toward it without deciding to. She had seen this place before. She had seen it from the kitchen window in her second morning in the cabin, and she had not asked about it because Jasper had been standing beside her and had gone quiet, and she had understood, in the way a woman understands these things, that it was not a question to ask on a second morning. Now on her 10th, she stepped up to the low fence and looked over. 3 headstones. The largest one at the back, carved from a rough gray granite that must have been hauled up the switchback from a quarry somewhere, bore words she had to brush snow from with her gloved hand to read. Margaret Rose Ravenscroft, beloved wife and mother, 1826 to 1866. She walked in the light and carried it with her. Next to it, nearly the same size as second stone, Silas Ravenscroft, 1828 to 1866, builder of this house, keeper of his word. And then in front of them, both smaller than the others, its edges carved with more care than the rough tools of these mountains should have allowed, a third stone. Eleanor Marie Ravenscroft, born and gone to God the same day, November 1866, the sister we did not get to know. Harriet stood in the snow with her gloved hand resting on the top rail of the little fence and read the 3 stones twice, then 3 times. A baby, a mother and a baby, dying on the same day. In November, in a blizzard in these mountains, with the men of the house a day's ride away in Helena buying winter flour, her throat closed. She felt him before she heard him. A quiet presence at her shoulder, the creak of a boot on packed snow. Jasper. She did not turn around. She did not trust her face. I am sorry, she said softly. He stepped up beside her and rested his own hand on the rail next to hers. He was not wearing his hat, and the morning sun caught the wheat color of his hair and turned it almost gold. There is nothing to be sorry for, Hattie. I am glad you saw them. They should be known. Jasper, yes, your mother was pregnant when your father died. Yes, and she died in childbirth the same year. Yes, she was 40 years old. Ezra was 18, I was 15, Gid was 20. Harriet closed her eyes and saw all at once a clearer picture than she had yet allowed herself to see. A young mother, heavy with a late child, widowed 3 months, standing in the doorway of a mountain cabin with a shotgun in her hands, and a rich man on her porch telling her what her land was worth. And 3 young men riding down to Helena for winter supplies, trusting that their mother had 1 more week before her time came, and a set of wagon tracks in the snow that had no right to be there. And the baby, the smallest stone, Eleanor Marie. She opened her eyes. Jasper, she said, there is more to this story, is there not? Jasper was quiet for a long moment. Yes, he said finally, there is more, but it is not my story to finish. It is Gideon's. And he will tell it to you, Hattie. I promise you that. But he will tell it in his own time and in his own way. He has been carrying it for 12 years, and he does not set it down easily. She nodded. They stood together, looking at the 3 stones and at the bright, hard morning above them, and Harriet understood something she had not understood before. that the cabin behind her was not only a house, that the three men she had come into the middle of were not only brothers, that the long, patient, hand-carved quality of everything inside those walls, the books and the rug and the piano and the journal on her nightstand and the dried lavender on the windowsill, was the slow, careful work of three men who had been trying for 12 years to keep a dead woman's house alive for her. And she, Harriet Whitlock of Boston, had been dropped into the middle of it. She had not replaced Margaret Rose Ravenscroft. No one ever could. But she had, without knowing it, walked into a house that had been holding its breath for more than a decade, waiting for a woman to enter and begin its lungs working again. "I want to help," she said. Jasper looked at her. "I want to help bring this house back," she said. "I want to play her piano. I want to cook in her kitchen. I want to wear her coat until it is warm on the pegs by the door every morning, not cold. I want your brothers to laugh. I want you to laugh. I did not come here to take her place. But if there is a place beside her that wants filling, I want to fill it." Jasper's eyes had gone bright with unshed water. He looked away toward the ridge. "Hattie," he said, a little thickly, "we have been waiting for you for a long time. We just did not know what your name was going to be." They walked back to the cabin together in silence, and neither of them spoke of the graves again that day. But something had shifted. The weeks began to pass. Harriet learned to keep the kitchen. She learned to bank a fire down so low at night that it would still be alive at first aid and a single breath would bring it back. She learned from Jasper how to stretch a slab of smoked venison across a week's worth of suppers. She learned from Cordelia Hollister on a long visit the old woman made up from the lower farm how to make a sourdough starter from wild yeast and cold mountain water, and how to knead the bread on a board dusted with flour from the stone crock on the shelf. She learned from watching her own mistakes how to salt butter properly and how to tell a good egg from a bad one by floating it in cold water. She learned from Ezra how to load and fire a small pocket pistol. She had not asked to learn it. He had simply come into the kitchen one afternoon while she was peeling potatoes and set a small nickel-plated Derringer on the table beside her and a box of cartridges beside it, and he had said in his quiet voice, "Hattie, you should know how to use this. Come with me when you are done." She went. He took her down to the riverbank where the sound would carry least, and he stood behind her shoulder and taught her to brace her wrist and sight down the short barrel, and he had her fire 6 rounds into an old tin can set on a stump at 20 paces. The first shot went wild. The second caught the stump. The fourth knocked the can spinning. She turned to him, still shaking from the recoil. "Ezra, why?" He looked at her, those pale gray blue eyes. A man who used very few words and chose each one. "Because Mallory knows you are here," he said, "and a woman on this mountain should never be unarmed. That is all." He would not say more. He simply helped her clean the pistol and wrap it in oilcloth and placed it in the drawer of her nightstand upstairs, and when she came down again, he was gone back into the timber, leaving only his tracks in the snow. She taught Jasper French. That had been his idea. He had sat down next to her one evening after supper and said a little shyly, "Hattie, I have always wanted to understand what those Canadian fur traders were saying when they came through here when I was a boy. Mama knew a little. She tried to teach me, but I was too young to listen. Could you?" So she taught him. "Bonsoir. Comment ça va? Je m'appelle Jasper Ravenscroft." He struggled with the nasal sounds and laughed helplessly at his own pronunciation, and the oldest brothers, sitting across the room mending a bridle, would occasionally make a small noise that was not quite a chuckle, and Jasper would flush and start over. She read to them in the evenings, at first only to Jasper because he was the one who asked. Then Ezra would drift in and take up a seat in the corner with his whittling, and Gideon would settle into his rocking chair by the fire and close his eyes. And by the end of the first week, she had an audience of 3 grown men who listened to her read Les Miserables aloud with the attentiveness of children at their mother's knee. She played the piano. She played it very badly the first night. Her fingers were stiff from the cold and out of practice, and the piano itself newly tuned, or had not been touched by any hand but a tuner's in 12 years. and it took some coaxing to sing properly. But by the end of the first week, she could play Stephen Foster without hesitation, and by the end of the second, she had taught herself a rough but passable rendition of a Chopin nocturne from memory, and on the night she first played the Chopin all the way through without a stumble, she looked up from the keys to find Jasper weeping silently on the stone hearth, and Ezra standing frozen in the doorway with firewood forgotten in his arms, and Gideon sitting in his rocking chair with one large scarred hand pressed flat over his mouth. She stopped with her fingers above the keys. "I am sorry," she said. "I should not have." "No," Gideon's voice came out hoarse. "Please do not be sorry. Please play it again." She played it again. Ranger lay on the rug and thumped his tail in time. The fire crackled. Outside, the wind moved through the pines, and from very far away up near the ridgeline, a single wolf called once and was answered by another. That night, walking upstairs to her room with the lantern in her hand, Harriet passed Gideon on the landing. He was coming out of his own room carrying a heavy wool blanket, meaning to take it down to Jasper by the fire. They both stopped. The landing was narrow. The lantern in her hand threw a circle of warm yellow light around them. They stood a foot apart, and his amber eyes were on her face, and neither of them moved for a long moment. Then he bent his head slowly and pressed his lips not to her lips but to her temple at the hairline just above her ear. The kiss was so gentle she could barely feel it. He lingered there a half-second longer than he should have. "Good night, Hattie," he murmured into her hair. "Good night, Gideon." She went into her room and closed the door and leaned her back against it, and she stood in the dark for a long time listening to her own heartbeat, and she understood that something had crossed over in her that was not going to cross back. In the third week of November, the first true trouble arrived. She was hanging linen on a line stretched between the cabin and the spring house, a basket of clean wet sheets at her feet. The air was cold but dry, and the breeze was just enough to dry cloth without freezing it stiff. Ranger was lying in the yard behind her, gnawing contentedly on a deer bone Jasper had given him. She heard the hoof beats before the dog did, which was strange. 4 riders, coming up the long wagon track from the valley at an easy pace, not in a hurry, which was in its own way a warning. A man in a hurry meant trouble you could see. A man riding slowly meant trouble he was sure of. Ranger's head came up. He began to growl a low rumble that did not stop when she touched his collar. The riders came into the yard. In the front, on a tall black horse, a man in a long black broadcloth coat with a gold watch chain across his waistcoat. Clean-shaven, pale gray eyes, a face handsome in the way of certain snakes. Royce Mallory. Behind him 3 men, younger, armed. The one on the left had a Winchester across his saddle bow. The one on the right had a pistol loose in its holster. The one in the center had the dull, flat eyes of a man who had been paid not to have opinions. Ezra was in the high timber tracking the wolf that had been circling the herd. Jasper was in the north pasture checking on a calf born out of season. Gideon was splitting fence rails on the far side of the cattle shed, 200 yards off and downwind, and he would not hear the riders arrive unless she called. Harriet Whitlock set down the wet sheet she was holding. She bent slowly as if to adjust her skirt, and she felt in the hidden pocket Cordelia Hollister had sewn into the seam of her apron at the wedding, the hard, small weight of the derringer Ezra had taught her to carry there every morning. She stood. "Mr. Mallory," she said. Mr. Mallory smiled. "Mrs. Ravenscroft," he said, tipping his hat. "I do hope I am not interrupting your morning." His voice was smooth and carried a Boston edge she had not heard in weeks, the clipped professional cadence of a man who had once been educated back east and had never quite let it go. It was that voice more than his face that made her skin crawl, because it was a voice that sounded like Horace Finch, like a dozen parlor gentlemen she had sat across from since her father's death, a voice that meant transactions and contracts, and the subtle pressure that passes for civility among wolves. "What do you want, Mr. Mallory?" "Please." "Royce." He swung one leg over and dismounted with unhurried grace. The 3 men behind him did not dismount. Ranger's growl was now a continuous low thunder at her heel. "I have come to extend a neighborly welcome to the newest lady of the Bitterroot," Mallory said. You have been up here some weeks, and I have been meaning to ride up. I thought perhaps I had let it go too long. He took a slow step toward her. Mr. Mallory. She kept her voice even. Stop there. He stopped, still smiling. He raised his gloved hands slightly, palms out, a gesture of such exaggerated innocence that it was a provocation in itself. Mrs. Ravenscroft, may I speak plainly? You may. A woman of your education and your breeding does not belong on this mountain. She belongs in a parlor, with porcelain and silk and other women to talk with. I have a house in Silver Creek with 8 bedrooms, a Steinway brought out from San Francisco, a full staff, and a library of 1,500 volumes. I have credit with the finest dressmakers in Denver and Chicago. I have the means, Mrs. Ravenscroft, to restore you to the life you were born to, the life your father intended for you, the life you have no doubt been grieving since the day you stepped off that stagecoach. Harriet's mouth went dry. The casual mention of her father, the knowledge of her education, the little prod about the life she had been born to. He had been reading her. He had been having her read. You are mistaken, Mr. Mallory, she said. I am exactly where I belong. He tilted his head. The smile did not slip, but something cold moved behind his gray eyes. Are you quite certain of that? Tell me, has your husband spoken to you yet about his younger sister? About Eleanor Marie? About the night she was born? The world narrowed. The sheets, the men on horseback. All of it went a little distant. She felt the blood leave her face, and she did not try to hide it. Ask him, Mallory said softly. Ask him what I was doing at this cabin the night his mother died. Ask him why his sheriff never arrested anyone. Ask him, and when you have the answer, Mrs. Ravenscroft, ask yourself whether a man who has been lying to you by omission for nearly a month is the kind of man you can trust with your future. My offer will stand. You have only to send word. He touched the brim of his hat. He turned back toward his horse. Mallory. The voice came from across the yard. Calm, even. The voice of a man who has been there for longer than anyone knew. Gideon. He had come around the corner of the cattle shed at some point during Mallory's speech without a sound, as he always moved when he was hunting. His coat was open. His hat was pushed back. In his right hand, held low at his side so that only the part of it visible at his hip would show, was the Army Colt revolver that normally lived in a holster hung on a peg by the front door. Behind him by 10 feet, stepped out of the timber along the fence line, Ezra was kneeling in the snow with his long Sharps rifle braced across a stump, the barrel pointed straight at the head of the rider with the Winchester. Jasper from the far side had come up silent on the north flank with his own carbine and had taken the man in the middle into his sights. Harriet had not seen any of them arrive. Mallory had certainly not. The 3 men on horseback went very still. Gideon walked slowly across the yard until he stood between Mallory and Harriet. He did not raise the Colt. He did not need to. The angle of Ezra's rifle behind him was doing all the speaking that needed to be done. Get off my land, Gideon said quietly. Mallory, to his credit, did not flinch, but his gaze flicked once to Ezra in the timber and once to Jasper on the north slope, and his pale gray eyes did a small internal calculation that Harriet could almost see. Gideon, Mallory said in a tone of mild social reproach, as if he had been invited to tea and found the host behaving poorly. We were having a perfectly civil conversation. You were threatening my wife. I was making her an offer. There is a difference. Get off my land. The words came out like 3 nails being driven into wet wood, each one final. Harriet saw from her position by the laundry line the muscle work in Gideon's jaw and the whiteness of the knuckles on the hand that held the Colt. Mallory smiled again. He touched his hat again. He mounted his black horse with that same unhurried grace. He turned his horse's head, and as he turned, still smiling, he looked back over his shoulder at Harriet. Ask him about Eleanor Marie, he called lightly. Ask him what I know. Then he and his 3 men rode slowly down the wagon track toward the valley, unhurried at exactly the pace they had arrived, and the gold watch chain on his waistcoat caught the morning sun one last time before the trees swallowed them. Nobody spoke for a long time after they were gone. Ezra came down out of the timber with his rifle resting across his forearm. Jasper came down from the north slope and put his hand on Ranger's collar and quieted the dog. Gideon stood in the middle of the yard with the Colt still in his hand, staring at the point on the wagon track where the riders had disappeared. Harriet walked over to him on legs that did not feel entirely her own. Gideon. He did not turn. Gideon, look at me. Slowly he turned his head. His amber eyes found hers, and she saw in them for the first time not the quiet, measured calm she had come to know, but a pure white burning rage so cold it seemed to have its own weather. She took his free hand in both of hers. Gideon, tell me. He looked down at their clasped hands. The Colt in his other hand was shaking not with fear, with effort, with the whole held-back force of 12 years of patience finally about to come loose. He closed his eyes. He took a long breath. He let it out. Come inside, he said. They sat at the walnut table that evening with the lanterns lit and the fire banked high, and a bottle of whiskey that Gideon had not opened in 3 years uncorked between them. Jasper was at the hearth with Ranger. Ezra was in his chair by the window, cleaning the sharps with slow, methodical care, his pale eyes never leaving his brother's face. Harriet sat across from Gideon with her hands folded in her lap, and she waited because she had told him she would wait. Gideon told her the whole story. He told her about his mother, Margaret Rose O'Donnell of County Cork, who had come to America as a young girl with her family in the late 30s, had met a young rancher named Silas Ravenscroft at a flour mill. In Denver, when she was nearly 20, had married him within 6 weeks and had followed him up here to the Bitterroot. He told her about Royce Mallory, then a young clerk in the same Denver firm that Silas Ravenscroft had once sold cattle to. Mallory had courted Margaret Rose intensely for 3 weeks before she met Silas, and Margaret Rose had laughed in his face when he proposed because she was a spirited young woman who was allowed to laugh in the face of a man who had made her feel small, and she had done so. Mallory had come to Montana 5 years later. He had bought land. He had made money. He had extended credit. By the time Silas Ravenscroft died, Royce Mallory owned most of Silver Creek in one way or another. And the one piece of property he did not own was the cabin and the acreage on the Bitterroot that belonged to his old rival's widow. He told her about this morning 3 months after his father's funeral, when Mallory had ridden up here with 2 men and offered to buy the land for $2,000. He told her how his mother had taken down the shotgun from above the door and aimed it at Mallory's waistcoat, and told him that if he set foot on this porch again, she would put a hole through his gold watch chain. He told her how Mallory had ridden away smiling. He told her about the trip to Helena, the winter flower, the doctor they had hoped to bring back who had already left the territory for the season, the one night's delay at an inn because the younger brothers had caught a fever and could not ride, the ride home in the first snow, the sight in the yard of their own wagon tracks going out, and 2 other sets of wagon tracks coming in and going back out again. He told her about his mother, about finding her, about the baby born an hour before they arrived too early, turned wrong, gone before she had opened her eyes, about his mother bleeding out in her own bed, conscious just long enough to whisper to him, Gideon, they came. They did not have to touch me. They only had to frighten me. Tell your brothers I am not afraid. Tell them. His voice broke at that. He did not try to hide it. Jasper had his face in his hands at the hearth. Ezra had stopped cleaning the rifle. Harriet sat very still with her hands folded in her lap and felt the tears run down her face without moving to wipe them away. He told her the rest. The sheriff at that time bought and paid for the wagon tracks that had vanished under snow before any disinterested party could see them. The year of waiting, the night in Helena a year later, when a drunk man in a saloon had told the wrong story to the wrong brother. 4 men, Gideon said. That was the number. I killed one of them with my hands for what he said about my mother. 2 others drew on me in the fight that followed. They did not walk out. The 4th was the one who had driven Mallory's wagon that night, and I found him in a feedlot 3 days later, and I did not let him walk out of that lot either. I have never told my brothers the details. They do not need to carry them. The sheriff of Lewis and Clark County called it a brawl and closed the file because even then in 70, the whole territory was starting to suspect what Mallory was. But Mallory went free. Hattie. There was nothing on him. No witnesses alive, no papers, no confession. He went free. And he has been sitting down there in Silver Creek for 12 years, growing richer, waiting. Waiting for what Harriet whispered, for something new. Gideon looked up at her. Something I could lose. She understood. She rose from the table. She walked around to his chair. She took his scarred face in her two small hands, and she bent down and she pressed her forehead to his. He is not going to take me, Gideon. Do you hear me? I am not a thing that can be taken. I am a woman who chose this house, and I choose it again tonight, and I will keep choosing it. He cannot take what was freely given. Gideon's eyes closed. He turned his face into her palm. Mama, he whispered, not to Harriet, to a grave on a ridge behind the cabin. Mama, I promised you, I am keeping it. Harriet wrapped her arms around his head and held him against her while he wept, the oldest of the Ravenscroft brothers, 6.5 feet of killer and carpenter and son, and she looked across the room through her own tears and met the eyes of Jasper and of Ezra, and the three of them held each other's gaze in the firelight, and not one word was spoken. That night upstairs in her room, Harriet sat on the edge of her bed and looked at the open door, at the little wooden bird on her windowsill, at the sprig of lavender beside it, at the small nickel-plated derringer in the drawer of her nightstand. She understood now why Ezra had taught her to shoot. She understood now why Jasper watched the southern track every morning from the porch. She understood now why Gideon had slept with an old army colt within reach for 12 years. And she understood now with a clarity that went all the way to her bones that the war she had stumbled into by marrying a man she did not know had been burning for a very long time before she arrived, and that it had not yet reached its worst hour. Somewhere in her chest, fear and love had twisted themselves together into a single new thing she did not have a name for. But somewhere deeper still, she found a place that was not afraid at all, because she was at last where she belonged. And that, as any Ravenscroft man would tell you, was worth any price the mountain asked. The storm came 2 weeks after Royce Mallory rode out of the Ravenscroft yard. It began as a thin gray line drawn across the northern horizon just after breakfast. On a Tuesday, a suggestion of weather that Jasper took one look at and went immediately to the barn to double the pegs on the stable door. By noon, the line had become a wall. By 3 in the afternoon, the wall had swallowed the sun. By 5, the wind was screaming in the eaves of the cabin, loud enough that Ranger had retreated under the kitchen table and would not come out, and the snow was driving so hard against the window glass that you could not see the woodshed 20 feet from the back door. The temperature on the thermometer Jasper had nailed to the porch post dropped to 15 below zero, and then to 20 below, and then the glass shattered with a sound like a small pistol shot, and nobody checked the temperature again because there was no longer any point. It was, Cordelia Hollister would say afterward, the worst storm the Bitterroot had seen in 20 years. Harriet would say afterward that it was the night she understood what love looked like when it was stripped of every soft word and left with nothing but its bones. She had been coughing for 3 days before the storm came. A small dry cough at first, the kind of thing a woman brushes aside because there is bread to bake and wood to bring in, and a husband with scarred hands who needs his shirts mended. She had gone out to the clothesline 3 mornings before in only a thin shawl because the sun had been shining, and she had misjudged the wind, and she had stood too long in it, hanging sheets, and by evening her throat was raw, and her chest had begun to rattle. She had not told the brothers. She had taken a spoonful of honey and hot water before bed, and she had thought the cough would pass. It had not passed. By the morning of the storm, her forehead was hot to her own touch, and her breath came shallow. And when she bent to lift the coffee pot from the stove, a wave of dizziness took her so hard she had to set the pot down and grip the edge of the table to stay on her feet. Gideon, coming in from the yard with an armload of wood, saw her face and dropped the wood where he stood. "Hattie, I am fine," she said. He crossed the room in 3 strides and laid the back of his scarred hand against her forehead, and his amber eyes went very still. You are not fine. I'm only tired. Jasper. Yes. Get her into the rocking chair by the fire. Wrap her in every blanket we own. Ezra. Already going, Ezra said quietly from the doorway. He had seen the color of her face before his brother had, and he was already pulling on his coat. Going where Harriet said. Helena, Ezra said. Doctor. No. She tried to stand and the room tilted. No, Ezra? The storm. You cannot. I can. He was out the door before she could argue. By noon, Ezra had come back. The road to Helena was not passable. He had gotten 4 miles down the switchback and had turned around because his horse had gone chest deep into a drift, and he had known he would kill the animal before he got to the valley floor. He came into the cabin with snow caked on his eyebrows and his beard and a grim line set deep along his jaw, and he said only, not Helena. Silver Creek, Doc Pemberton, 22 miles, the lower road. If we can get that far. Gideon was at the window. The snow was moving sideways across the yard in sheets, and the temperature had fallen so low that the nails in the porch boards were popping with small reports like distant rifle shots. She was in the rocking chair by then, wrapped in 3 quilts, and her cough had deepened into something wet and ugly that she could hear herself, and Jasper had pressed a cool cloth to her forehead, and every time she drew a breath, it felt as if someone had laid a hot stone on her chest. I will go, Gideon said. Gid, Ezra said. I will go. Gid. The road from here to Silver Creek is 16 miles down and 6 miles across the flats. In this wind, no horse will keep its feet on the switchback. I am telling you this as a man who has just come back from trying. Then I will go on foot. Ezra looked at his older brother for a long moment. Jasper had stopped pressing the cloth to Harriet's forehead and was simply watching the two of them with his young face gone pale. Harriet whispered Gideon no. He came to her. He knelt in front of her rocking chair, and he took both of her 2 hot hands in his. His amber eyes were quiet and level, and he was smiling at her, that faint, private smile she had seen only a handful of times. A smile that had no humor in it at all, but was all the gentler for that. Hattie, he said softly, listen to me. She listened. I did not go through that storm in '66. I went to Helena with my brothers, and my mother lay alone in this cabin and died because I was not here. I have spent 12 years telling myself that there was nothing I could have done, that the weather would have killed any rider that night, that the blame belonged to Mallory and not to me. But tonight you are sitting in my mother's chair, in my mother's coat, with my mother's fever on you. And I am not going to sit in this cabin and wait to lose you too. Do you understand me? She was crying. She nodded. If I do not come back, Gideon, please. If I do not come back, he said, Ezra is the oldest and he knows how to run this place, and Jasper will look after you like a brother, and you will be safe. You will have the cabin for the rest of your life. I have put it in writing. The papers are in the box at the foot of my bed. Cordelia Hollister has a copy. Gideon. But I am coming back, he said. He brought her hands to his mouth and kissed her knuckles once. Because I am not losing what I have found. That is the word of a Ravenscroft man. He stood. He turned to his brothers. Ezra, you will not try to follow me. You stay here. If I am not back by sundown tomorrow, you will not go after me. You will stay here and you will keep her alive. Do you swear it? Ezra's jaw worked. Pale gray blue eyes, damp and furious. I swear it. Jasper, yes, Gid. Keep the fire up, every hour, all night, no matter what she says. I will. Gideon pulled on his long oilskin coat over 2 layers of wool. He wrapped his neck and most of his face in a long woven scarf Harriet had no idea his mother had made for him 30 years before in Nabalbon. He pulled his gloves on over a pair of knitted liners. He slung a leather satchel over his shoulder for the medicine. He took down the army colt from its peg and slid it into the deep inside pocket of the oilskin. He went out the door. He did not look back. Harriet watched him through the window as long as she could see him, which was not long. The yellow pinprick of his lantern moved across the yard, then down the slope toward the south track, and then the snow swallowed it, and she was looking out at nothing. She put her hot face in her hands and wept, and Jasper stood behind her rocking chair and laid one large, careful hand on her shoulder, and he did not tell her it would be all right because Jasper Ravenscroft had been raised not to lie to women about the weather. The fever climbed through the afternoon. By evening, she was no longer entirely in the cabin. She was in Boston, and her father was sitting at his desk correcting her Latin, and the gaslight was yellow on the green wallpaper of their parlor. She was in the boarding house. She was at St. Vincent's orphanage, and her brother Silas was clinging to her hand, and she was promising him that she would come for him no matter what. She was on the train pulling out of Boston. She was on the stagecoach. She was stepping off the stagecoach into nothing, and 3 men in oilskin coats were watching her from beside a freight wagon. "Gideon," she whispered in her fever. "Gideon." Jasper wiped her forehead. He changed the cloth. He fed the fire. He did what his brother had told him to do. Ezra sat by the window with his rifle across his knees and the cabin door bolted because there was no telling what else might come to that door on a night when Gideon Ravenscroft was out in the storm. Ranger lay at the foot of the rocking chair and refused to move. Outside, the wind spoke in a voice that had no human meaning. The cabin shuddered. A beam in the roof groaned, and somewhere out in the dark, miles down in the blinding white, a man was walking. He walked with his head bent against the wind and his scarf pulled up over his nose and the lantern clenched in one gloved hand and the other hand tucked inside his coat to save at least one set of fingers. He walked with army boots on because army boots were what you walked in when the weather meant business. And he walked with the memory of a winter road march in Wyoming in '72 that had killed 2 of his men and that he had sworn after that he would never repeat. And here he was repeating it because the alternative was unthinkable. He kept the fence line of the south pasture on his left shoulder. When the fence line ran out, he followed the stones of a creek bed he knew by heart. When the creek bed was drifted over, he walked by the feel of the ground under his boots, by the change in the wind as it passed between the walls of the canyon, by the smell of pine resin off the trees to the east. He lost feeling in his feet at the 3-hour mark. He lost feeling in his face at the 4-hour mark. At the 6-hour mark, he stopped in the lee of a great dead cottonwood that had stood on the lower flats as long as he had been alive, and he leaned his shoulder against the trunk and closed his eyes for only a moment, and the moment stretched longer than it should have, and he heard a voice, Gideon, his mother's voice, Irish, warm. "Get up, son, get up and walk." He got up, he walked. At 10 hours in the very darkest part of the night, and he came down off the last ridge into the sheltered hollow where Silver Creek sat, and the wind dropped behind him as the land dropped, and he saw through a thinning curtain of snow the yellow windows of Doc Pemberton's surgery at the south end of the town, the one building that always burned a lamp all night long, because Doc Pemberton was 68 years old and had not slept a full night in 35 years of frontier medicine. Gideon Ravenscroft pounded on the door with a fist that he could not feel. "Doc," he shouted into the wood. "Doc, it is Ravenscroft. My wife is dying." The door opened. Doc Pemberton, silver hair standing up in every direction in a long nightshirt with a wool robe over it, took one look at the man on his stoop and did not waste a word. He pulled Gideon inside. He sat him down in front of the stove. He pried the gloves off him finger by finger and got a basin of cool water and plunged Gideon's hands into it because in 40 below weather, the one thing you never do to a man's frozen hands is warm them too fast. "Listen to me, Gideon. Listen. You tell me what she has." Gideon told him. Fever. Cough 3 days, wet sound in the lungs, shaking chills. Had been out without proper warmth 3 days before. Pneumonia, Pemberton said. "I will give you what I have. Morphine for her pain, quinine for the fever, a tincture of my own laudanum mixed with camphor for the lungs. She will need to be bled if the fever climbs further, but I cannot send my own blade up the mountain. You tell Cordelia Hollister she has done it before she can do it again if it comes to it." He moved as he talked, pulling small dark bottles from his shelves, wrapping them in lint, packing them into an oilskin pouch. I cannot come with you, I know. I am too old to make that road tonight. I know, Doc. The little old man paused and looked up. His eyes were wet. Gideon, you should not be alive right now. I am aware of that, Doc. How long did it take you? 10 hours, maybe 11. Pemberton shook his head. He pressed the oilskin pouch into Gideon's hand. You cannot walk back. Yes, I can. You cannot walk back tonight. Not through that. You will die on that ridge and nobody will find you till spring, and the medicine in this pouch will freeze solid and do her no good at all. You will sleep 4 hours in my back room and eat a hot bowl of soup, and then you will take my Ben and you will ride back at first light. I will not argue this with you, boy. I buried your father. I am not burying you. Ben was Doc Pemberton's big old buckskin gelding, 20 hands of patient workhorse. Gideon had known the horse since he was a boy. Doc, 4 hours, Gideon, 4 hours. Or I will put the laudanum in your soup myself. He slept for 4 hours on a cot in the surgery. Pemberton woke him at first light with a bowl of soup and a second bowl of soup after that. Gideon ate standing up. He drank scalding coffee until his hands stopped shaking. He took the oilskin pouch and a second one Pemberton had added overnight, full of things the doctor had thought better of, and he went out into a morning that was colder than the night before and pale white with a sun that looked bleached. He rode. Ben the buckskin climbed the lower switchback with the patience of a horse who has climbed it 1,000 times in 40 years, and Gideon Ravenscroft rode with his face buried in the horse's mane at the worst stretches, and he rode up the ridges with the oilskin pouches clutched hard against his chest inside his coat, and he did not stop, and he did not turn around. 14 hours out from Silver Creek, he came up through the pines at the final bend, and there in the clearing, he saw the smoke rising from the chimney of the cabin on the Bitterroot, and he whispered a prayer he did not know he remembered, and he kicked Ben forward the last quarter mile. Inside the cabin, it was the third day of the storm, though the wind had finally begun to drop at daybreak. Harriet was no longer in the rocking chair. She was upstairs in the bed in her room because Jasper had carried her up there at some point in the night when she had stopped being able to sit up. She was breathing in a rattling, shallow way that Jasper had not heard since he had sat beside his mother in that same house 12 years before, and he had sat with his face buried against the quilt at the foot of the bed for the last hour, shaking. Ezra was at the front window with the rifle across his knees. When Ezra saw the figure riding up out of the timber, he did not at first believe it. He rose slowly from the chair. He wiped the window glass with his sleeve. He stared harder. Jasper, he said. Jasper, come here. Jasper came. They watched together as the buckskin and the bent figure on its back came up the last rise. He made it, Ezra whispered. By God, he made it. They ran out into the yard. Ezra reached Ben's bridle a step before his brother could fall off, and Jasper caught Gideon as he came down out of the saddle because Gideon could no longer stand up on his own. He shoved the oilskin pouches into Jasper's chest. Her, he rasped. Now, upstairs, camphor for the lungs, quinine for the fever, laudanum if she is in pain. Cordelia. Get Cordelia. Cordelia Hollister had gotten up the road that morning. In fact, as soon as the wind had begun to drop on a set of snowshoes her husband had made for her 40 years before when she was still young enough to use them properly. She was already inside the cabin. Jasper ran with the pouches. Ezra held his brother up as Gideon walked the last 10 yards into the cabin and collapsed onto the bench before the fire, and Ezra stripped the frozen coat off him and the frozen scarf and the frozen gloves, and he saw that 3 fingers on Gideon's left hand had gone white, and he cursed in a voice that was shaking. Gid, your hand. I know, Gid. I know, Ez, I know. Cordelia upstairs already with the pouches called down in her calm Scottish voice. Ezra, I need you up here. And to Gideon, you great stubborn fool of a man. Sit still. I will see to ye after the lass. She worked on Harriet for 2 hours. The camphor tincture under the nose to open the lungs. The quinine and hot water, small sips forced between her cracked lips. The cool cloths changed every few minutes. A poultice of mustard and flannel on her chest, which had been an old remedy Cordelia's grandmother had sworn by in the Highlands. The bleeding blade was not needed in the end, though Cordelia held it ready on the nightstand for most of the afternoon. And slowly, Harriet Whitlock Ravenscroft began to come back. Her breathing eased. The rattling in her chest softened. The fire of her fever broke at some point in the late afternoon, and she began to sweat honestly and cleanly. And Cordelia wiped her face and changed her nightdress and laid a dry quilt over her. The old Scotswoman came down the stairs at sunset with her sleeves rolled up and her gray hair sticking to her forehead, and she stopped at the bottom of the stairs and looked across the room at Gideon, who was sitting before the fire with both his hands soaking in a basin of slowly warming water, and she said quietly, "She will live, Gideon. The fever is broken. She will live." Gideon Ravenscroft set his face into his good hand and wept without making a sound. It was 3 days before the doctor finally permitted Harriet any visitors besides Cordelia, who had stayed to nurse her. It was on the evening of the third day that she opened her eyes fully and knew her own name, and the first face she saw was Gideon's. He was sitting in a chair drawn up to the side of her bed, his left hand heavily bandaged in white linen, his clothes clean, his face gaunt and hollowed in a way she had not seen before, as if the trip had taken 10 pounds from him that had not come back. "Gideon," she whispered. "Hattie." Her hand came up. He caught it in his good one and pressed it against his cheek. "You came back. I came back. Gideon, your hand." 3 fingertips. Frostbite. Doc says I will keep most of them. The tips may be stiff for the rest of my life. I will live. I told you not to go. I know. She began to cry. She could not help it. She turned her face into his shoulder as he leaned forward and gathered her into his arms, and he held her there, one good hand cradling the back of her head, the bandaged one at the small of her back, while she wept out 3 days of fear and gratitude and something larger than both. "Hattie," he said against her hair. "Yes, I did not walk through that storm for the medicine. No, I walked through it because I could not stand the thought of you being alone if anything went wrong. Because I have seen a woman in this cabin die alone, and I was not going to see it again. I know. I love you, Harriet Whitlock Ravenscroft. I loved you the day you walked out into the storm by the barn to bring us coffee and told us we were idiots for not eating. I loved you the night you played my mother's piano and made me understand that this house could be alive again. I know I am not the kind of man you grew up dreaming of marrying. I have blood on my hands. I have a past that will follow me until the day they put me in the ground on that ridge. But if you will stay, if you will take me as I am, I will spend the rest of my life making sure that you never regret the day you stepped off that stagecoach." She pressed her forehead against his chest, and she said barely above a whisper, "You are where I belong, Gideon Ravenscroft, and I am where I belong." That is all that needs saying. Outside, the storm had gone. The sun was setting clean and red over the Bitterroot, and the snow on the ridges caught the color and held it. And in the yard, the 3 small graves stood, and the fence around them, and the pines behind all of it bathed in that late red light. And inside the cabin, a man who had walked 22 miles through a blizzard and back again, so his wife would not die alone, held that wife in his arms, and downstairs his 2 brothers sat together at the walnut table, and neither of them spoke. And Ranger lay by the fire, and for the first time in 12 years and more, the cabin on the Bitterroot breathed easy. It was 2 weeks before Harriet was strong enough to come downstairs. It was 4 more days before she was strong enough to walk with Gideon down to the little fence plot behind the cabin and stand in front of the 3 stones, her hand in his, a wool shawl of Cordelia's around her shoulders, and speak aloud the names that had become part of her family. Margaret Rose, Silas, Eleanor Marie. She told them quietly that she would see to it that the house was lived in, that the piano would be played, that the fire would be kept, that their boys would be loved. The trouble from Silver Creek did not come that winter. Harriet discovered on a quiet afternoon alone in the cabin, while she was putting fresh linens into the cedar chest at the foot of Gideon's bed, a sealed envelope addressed in a careful, slanting hand to her husband. It had been opened. It was marked on the outside in ink, Sheriff Thaddeus Brennan, Silver Creek. She should not have read it. She read it. It was dated June of that year. It read, Gideon, I write you in haste and in some distress. A wire arrived today from Boston regarding one Horace Finch, a lender of some ill repute who has sold a matrimonial contract through an agency Mallory has been patronizing. The contract is for a young woman recently orphaned, Miss Harriet Whitlock, 23 years old. The agency broker has informed me privately that Mallory intends to be the paying party. If you have any mind to intervene, the broker can be persuaded to accept a higher bid, provided it is paid promptly and in full. Mallory does not yet know of a competing buyer. I hesitate to write this at all. Old friend, but I remember two others who have gone into Mallory's house by similar contract, and neither has ever been heard from again. If Miss Whitlock is to be saved from that fate, it will be by a man such as yourself. Yours in regret, Thad Brennan. Harriet sat down on the edge of the bed with the letter in her hands, and the world tilted. She had been a transaction. Gideon had outbid a monster for her. Everything, every soft word, every careful kiss on her forehead, every night of quiet conversation by the fire, every promise. Had it been all along a game of leverage played out in her honor over a letter she had never seen between two men who had been at war for 12 years before her name had ever reached the Bitterroot? She was packed within the hour. She did not tell Jasper what she had found. She did not tell Ezra. She waited for Gideon to come in from the south pasture, where he had been mending a stretch of fence damaged by the winter, and when he came through the door and saw her standing in the front room with her valise at her feet and his mother's coat folded over a chair behind her, he stopped. Hattie, I read the letter, she said. His face drained of color. Hattie, please, let me. No, I am going to Cordelia's. I need to think. I need to know whether anything you have said to me in this house has been real, or whether I have been a move on a chessboard between you and Mallory the whole time I have been here. I need to know it on my own. I cannot know it standing in this room with you, Hattie. Do not follow me. She put on Cordelia's wool coat over her traveling dress. She refused the horse Jasper tried to bring her. The road was 6 miles across a gentle southern ridge, and it was early afternoon, and the sky was clear, and she needed the walk more than she needed anything else. She walked. She was 4 miles out on a stretch of road that dropped down through open timber to a place where the ridge narrowed between two steep banks when she heard hoofbeats coming up fast behind her. 4 horses. She turned. Royce Mallory in his black broadcloth coat with 3 men behind him. Not the same 3 from before. Newer, harder. Mrs. Ravenscroft, he called in that polished Boston voice, smiling. I had heard you were on the road alone today. I could not let a lady walk so far unattended. Harriet's hand went into the hidden pocket of her dress, and she felt the small, hard weight of Ezra's derringer, where it had ridden there every day since the day he had sewn it in for her. She drew it. She thumbed back the hammer. She did not speak. Mallory laughed. The 3 men behind him drew their own weapons. One of them on the left leveled a pistol at her. And behind her from the trees on the south side of the road, Ezra Ravenscroft stepped out of cover with his Sharps rifle already at his shoulder, and Jasper Ravenscroft stepped out of the pines on the north side with his carbine up, and from directly behind Mallory on the ridge above Gideon, Ravenscroft stood with the army Colt in his good hand and his amber eyes level as the horizon. You have come too far down this road this time, Mallory Gideon said softly. The man on the left with the pistol aimed at Harriet looked up at Gideon above him and made his choice. He swung his pistol toward Gideon. Harriet fired her derringer. The round took Mallory's horse in the shoulder, and the horse screamed and went down, and Mallory went sideways out of the saddle into the frozen road. Ezra's rifle cracked, and the man with the pistol took a round through the wrist and dropped his weapon into the snow. Jasper's carbine spoke, and another man's saddle gun leapt out of his hands and spun into the ditch. The 4th man, the one who had not yet drawn, turned his horse and rode, and no Ravenscroft shot at him Because a man who runs at the first real shot is a man who is telling you he does not want to die that day. Mallory came up onto his knees in the snow, his gray eyes wild, his hand clawing for the small pistol in his inside breast pocket. He got it out. He raised it. And Gideon Ravenscroft, on the ridge above, did not fire. He walked down. He walked down through the snow with the army colt hanging easy at his side, and he stopped 4 paces from the kneeling man in the black broadcloth coat. And he looked at him, and Mallory raised the pistol at Gideon's chest with a trembling hand. "Do it," Mallory hissed. "Do it, Ravenscroft. That is what you are. That is what you always were." Gideon looked at Royce Mallory for a long, silent moment. Then he lowered the hammer on the Colt, and he slid it back into its holster, and he said very quietly, "No, no. You are not worth my soul, not any longer. You will stand trial, Mallory, and you will face the families you broke. I have waited 12 years to kill you. I am done waiting because I have finally understood that killing you will not bring my mother back, and it will take something from a woman down the road there who deserves better from her husband than another killing. I am a Ravenscroft man, and a Ravenscroft man keeps his word." He looked at Mallory. "And my word tonight is that you will live long enough to be hanged by the state of Montana." Sheriff Thad Brennan and 2 deputies came up out of the lower trees a minute later, because Gideon had sent Brennan word the night before that he believed Mallory would try something on the southern track, and Brennan had ridden up at dawn and had been waiting with the Ravenscroft brothers in the timber for hours. Mallory was bound. The 3 wounded men with him were bound. The Boston lender Horace Finch, the sheriff, told them later that evening over whiskey in the cabin, had already sent a second wire breaking under his own fear, a wire that named Mallory as the man behind at least 2 previous disappearances of young women, and a wire that included the hidden testimony of a woman who had been Mallory's wife 15 years before, and who had fled to Denver and lived in terror ever since. Eleanor Mallory, the sheriff said, would testify. She had already agreed. Harriet did not hear most of this. She was standing in the road at the moment the sheriff and the deputies came out, with Gideon holding her tight against his chest, both of them shaking. "I am so sorry," Gideon was whispering into her hair. "I should have told you about the letter a month ago. I should have told you the day you arrived. I was afraid you would think I had only saved you as a move against him. And that was not the truth, Hattie. The truth is I may have ridden down the mountain that first day because of him. But every day after that, every single day after that, has been because of you. I am not in love with a chess move. I am in love with a woman who taught my brother French and brought us coffee in a blizzard and played my mother's piano and made me a home. I know," she whispered back, her face against his coat. "I know. I knew it when I saw you walk down to him with the Colt in your hand and I saw you lower it. A chess move would have killed him, Gideon. A husband let him live." Overhead, the late winter sun came fully out from behind a single slow cloud, and the high white of the Bitterroot ridges caught the light and gave it back, and a pair of crows lifted from the pines and called to each other across the quiet. The war was over. Spring was coming. Royce Mallory stood trial in the territorial court at Helena in the 3rd week of April 1879, and the trial lasted 9 days, and at the end of it 12 men sat in the jury box and pronounced him guilty of murder, in the 1st degree for the killing of Margaret Rose Ravenscroft, guilty of the unlawful taking of 2 women whose bodies had been found that winter on a south pasture, and guilty of the conspiracy to abduct Mrs. Harriet Whitlock Ravenscroft of the Bitterroot. The judge sentenced him to hang. Eleanor Mallory, the first wife he had beaten nearly to death 15 years before, sat in the front row of the gallery every day of the trial in a plain black dress, and when the verdict came in, she did not cheer, she did not weep. She only rose slowly to her feet and inclined her head once to the jury and once to the Ravenscroft brothers sitting across the aisle. And she walked out of that courthouse a free woman for the first time in her life. She lived another 22 years in Denver. She never remarried. She and Harriet wrote letters to each other once a month until the day Eleanor died in the spring of 1901, and every one of those letters began with the same 2 words in Eleanor's careful slanting hand: "Dear sister." The hanging took place on the last Friday of May. The Ravenscroft brothers did not go down to watch. Gideon said the weight of Royce Mallory was no longer his to carry, and a man who watched another man die when he did not have to was a man who was still doing the other man's work for him. Instead, on the morning of the hanging, Gideon and Ezra and Jasper and Harriet walked the half-mile out to the little fenced plot behind the cabin, and they stood together in front of the three stones in the early spring sun, with the last of the snow melting around their boots, and Gideon said quietly, "Mama, Papa, Eleanor, it is done." And then he picked up his hat off the ground where he had laid it down, and he turned and he walked back to the cabin with his wife under his arm, and he did not speak of Royce Mallory again as long as he lived. They held the second wedding on the first Sunday of June. It was Harriet's idea, though Cordelia Hollister would take credit for it for the rest of her life. "I have been your wife by law since October," Harriet had told Gideon one evening as they sat out on the porch watching the light go long across the valley. "But I was not yet myself when I said those vows. I would like to say them again, now that I know who I am and who you are. If you will have me." Gideon had not answered her. He had simply stood up, and he had gone out to the barn, and he had come back half an hour later with the old mountain pony saddled and a basket in his hand, and he had helped her up behind him, and he had ridden her 3 miles up the ridge to a high meadow where wildflowers were just beginning to open in the June sun. There, under a single ancient lodgepole pine, whose trunk Silas Ravenscroft had carved his wife's name into in 1853, Gideon had asked Harriet again to marry him. Not for law, not for debt, not for rescue. For the whole life he hoped they might be given. Yes, she had said. On the Sunday they were married beneath that pine. Reverend T. Whitfield came up the ridge on his long-eared mule, with his Bible wrapped in oilcloth, as he had come the first time. Winston and Cordelia Hollister came on their patient farm horses, Cordelia with a basket full of hothouse lilies she had nursed through the winter on her kitchen window. The Sheriff Thad Brennan came up in a surrey with his wife Honora, and Doc Pemberton rode up behind them on Old Ben the Buckskin, who had earned himself a hero's retirement and a daily ration of molasses oats at the Hollister farm. And down from Chicago on the Union Pacific with a new trunk and a new suit and 3 more inches of height than Harriet remembered him having, came Silas Whitlock, 13 years old now, scrubbed to a shine, carrying under one arm a leather folder containing the first full essay he had written in Latin at the Chicago boarding school his sister's marriage had paid for. When Silas stepped off the Hollister wagon in the Ravenscroft yard, Harriet flew to him across the grass and crushed him against her in a way that made him squeak, and then she held him at arm's length and looked at him and said, "You have grown half a foot," and then she cried, and then Silas cried, and then Jasper Ravenscroft, who had lost his own mother young and knew a boy who needed a big brother when he saw one, knelt down in the dirt and put out his large calloused hand and said very seriously, "Silas Whitlock, I am Jasper. I am going to teach you everything I know about horses and rifles and wild honey, and you are going to come up here every summer until you are old enough to choose not to." Silas, who had the careful gray eyes of his father, looked at the great wheat-haired youngest Ravenscroft for a long moment. Then he put his small hand into Jasper's, and he shook it once firmly the way his own father had taught him. A man shakes hands. "Yes, sir. Mr. Ravenscroft," he said. Jasper, the big man, corrected gently. "Just Jasper." Jasper said, "Silas." Gideon, standing on the porch watching, turned his face away so that no one would see him wipe his eyes with the heel of his scarred hand. That afternoon, under the pine tree in the high meadow, Harriet and Gideon stood hand in hand before Reverend Whitfield. And this time when the minister said, "You may kiss the bride," Gideon Ravenscroft bent his head and kissed his wife on the mouth, not on the forehead, with all the people who mattered to them, standing in a quiet ring around the pine, and the bitterroot ridges blue in the distance, and the high meadow grass rippling around their boots like a slow green sea. Cordelia Hollister wept openly. Winston clapped his old friend Gideon on the shoulder and said, "Well now, lad." "Well now," which was apparently the only phrase Winston Hollister knew for great joy, and Silas Whitlock stood between Jasper and Ezra and looked up at the 2 mountain men on either side of him, and grinned so widely his face seemed too small for it. That evening there was a fiddle and a banjo, and Jasper's old guitar, and Harriet played her mother-in-law's piano through the open cabin windows, and they danced on the boards of the porch until after moonrise, and Silas fell asleep with his head on Ezra's shoulder before the moon was high, and Ezra carried him gently up the stairs to the bed that had been made ready for him in what had once been the nursery Margaret Rose Ravenscroft had fitted out for a baby girl named Eleanor, and would now be the summer bedroom of her sister-in-law's young brother for as many years as he wanted it. And late that night, when the guests had gone down to the Hollister farm to sleep, and the brothers had gone to their beds, and the cabin was quiet, Gideon Ravenscroft stood with his wife on the porch of the house he had built and looked out over the moonlit valley, and he put his arms around her, and he held her, and he said softly into her hair, "Welcome home, Hattie." "I have been home a long time," she answered. "You were just waiting to ask." The years began to pass as years do in a country where the seasons do not ask permission. In the early autumn of 1879, Harriet Ravenscroft told her husband and her brothers-in-law one evening around the walnut table that she was going to have a baby. Jasper stood up so fast he knocked over his chair. Ezra went quite still, his pale gray blue eyes filled, and he nodded once, and he reached across the table and laid his scarred hand over his brother's scarred hand and did not let go. Gideon, sitting across from his wife, stared at her as if she had just told him that the sun would rise in a new place tomorrow. Then he came around the table very slowly, and he knelt on the kitchen floor in front of her chair, with the firelight on his face, and he laid his bandaged hand on the front of her plain wool dress, and he bent his head, and he did not say anything for a long time. In the first week of April 1880, with Cordelia Hollister and old Doc Pemberton at her bedside, and the three Ravenscroft brothers pacing the porch below in a frozen silence that terrified every cow in the pasture, Harriet bore a daughter. The little girl came out with a fierce pink face and a tuft of wheat-colored hair and a strong set of lungs. Cordelia wrapped her and placed her in her mother's arms, and Harriet looked at the small new Ravenscroft and said, "We will call her Margaret Rose." When Gideon came upstairs into the bedroom and saw the name his mother had carried laid gently against his wife's shoulder, he sat down on the edge of the bed with his face in his hands, and he wept without any shame at all. And his daughter, all of 20 minutes old, opened her eyes and looked at her great scarred father and did not cry. She only studied him calmly, the way Ravenscrofts had always studied the world, as if to see what kind of man he was going to be to her. He was going to be all of it. Ezra Ravenscroft was married in the summer of 1882 at the age of 34 to a quiet, dark-haired young woman named Prudence Ashford, who had come out from Ohio to take the position of librarian at the new Silver Creek Reading Room. She had known the Ravenscroft name from the very first week she set foot in the town, and she had known it the way the whole town knew it, as a name of old killing and older shadow. And she had met Ezra Ravenscroft for the first time when he walked into her library 3 weeks after its opening and laid down a wooden crate containing 47 leather-bound books that had belonged to his mother, and he had said quietly, "They should be read, ma'am. Mother would have liked them read." Prudence Ashford had looked at the great silent man in front of her, and she had looked at the books he had carried down a mountain on the back of a mule for a town she owed nothing to, and she had decided before the end of that afternoon that the Ravenscroft name was a liar. She and Ezra courted without fuss and married without ceremony the following July, under the same pine tree where Gideon and Harriet had spoken their second vows, and they built a small, neat cabin a half-mile from the main house, and Prudence would bear Ezra 5 children over the next 11 years, each one of them with their father's pale gray blue eyes. Jasper Ravenscroft did not marry until the autumn of 1880, when he was 29, and when he could no longer go on pretending that he had not been in love with Rosalind Brennan, the sheriff's only daughter, since she was 16 years old and he was 23. The Brennans had approved of the match from the first evening Jasper had come down to Silver Creek with a load of mountain honey and a borrowed white shirt and asked his ears red if he might be permitted to call upon their daughter. Rosalind was a bright, sharp-tongued girl with her mother's black hair and her father's calm good sense, and when she married Jasper, she did not move up to the Bitterroot alone. She brought with her a piano tuner, a seamstress, and two young neighbor women who wanted to make their living in the high country, and she made the long, empty ridge between the Ravenscroft cabin and the Hollister farm feel within a single year like the beginning of a small and stubborn community. Between them, Harriet and Gideon had three children. After Margaret Rose in 1880 came Edmund James, named for Harriet's father in the summer of 1883, a serious boy with his grandfather's thin wrists and a head for numbers that made Ezra shake his head in wonder. And in the deep winter of 1885, the youngest Silas Matthew, named for his grandfather Ravenscroft, and for the uncle in Chicago who had long since stopped being a boy. Silas Whitlock himself, the little brother for whom Harriet had walked 1,500 miles west, into a life she did not know, came up to the Bitterroot every summer from the age of 13 to the age of 18, and he learned from Jasper how to shoot a rifle and ride a rough country horse, and he learned from Ezra how to track a deer through light snow, and he learned from Gideon how to repair a broken harness at 3 in the morning by the light of a barn lantern, and he learned from his sister how to say a grace that mattered over a meal of elk stew and fresh bread. He went back to Chicago for his final schooling and then on to the college at Denver, where the money Gideon had sent with him as a boy had been quietly added to over the years. An envelope at Christmas, another at Easter, always in Harriet's hand, but drawn on the Ravenscroft account. Silas graduated from Denver in the summer of 1891 with a degree in law, and he did not hesitate about where he would practice. He came straight home to Montana. He opened a small office in Silver Creek above the general store, and he took on cases for homesteaders being pressured by the railroad, for widows whose late husbands' deeds had been recorded carelessly, for Shoshone families whose land allotments had been quietly shaved, and within a few years there was not a corrupt clerk in the county seat who did not know the name Silas Whitlock and know it as a name to be careful of. He would be raised to the bench of the State Court of Montana at the age of 40, and he would preside there for the rest of his working life. Winston Hollister died in the winter of 1892 at the age of 79, quiet in his bed with Cordelia holding his hand and his old dog at his feet. They buried him on the ridge between the Ravenscroft cabin and the Hollister farm on a little shelf of land where the wildflowers came in earliest in spring, and Cordelia wore widow's black for exactly 1 year and then went back to wearing the good dark blue she had worn to Harriet's wedding, because she said tartly, Winston had always preferred her in blue, and she saw no reason to offend his shade by any other choice. Cordelia Hollister herself lived to be 94 years old. She would hold all three of Harriet's babies on her Scottish lap. She would teach Margaret Rose Ravenscroft the shortbread recipe her own mother had taught her in the Highlands in 1842. She would die in her own bed in the winter of 1910, and Harriet would be holding one hand, and Margaret Rose would be holding the other. Old Doc Pemberton died not long after Winston in the spring of 1893, quietly at his desk in the little surgery that had burned a lamp all night for 37 years. Silver Creek grieved him the way towns grieved the men who have held them together through every fever and every winter and every birth and every bad dying. Gideon Ravenscroft rode down to help dig the grave himself in deep, frozen ground and would not let any younger man take a turn with the shovel. And through all of it, through the first decade and the second, through the babies and the marriages and the funerals and the cattle lost to winter, in the slow brightening of a mountain that had been too silent for too many years, the cabin on the Bitterroot held. Jasper taught himself 3 chords on his mother's old guitar, and then a 4th, and by the time Silas Matthew was 10 years old, his uncle was known for 8 miles in every direction as the finest frontier banjo player north of the Powder River. Ezra carved. He carved for his own children and for Jasper's and for Gideon's, and eventually for every baby born in Silver Creek within a week's ride, tiny wooden birds and horse and bears, each one signed on the underside in a cramped ER that the children of Silver Creek would treasure in shoeboxes for the rest of their long lives. Gideon Ravenscroft grew gray at the temples, then at the beard, then all the way through. The old bullet scar on his eyebrow faded to a silver thread. The 3 frostbitten fingers on his left hand stiffened as Doc Pemberton had warned, and he had to learn to shoot right-handed when he had been a left-handed man all his life. and he bore that learning without complaint. He held his wife's hand every morning before he left the house, and every evening when he came home, and he never once, not once, in all the long years of their marriage, went to sleep without telling her that he loved her. Harriet Whitlock Ravenscroft, who had stepped down out of a stagecoach in October of 1878, with a small leather valise and no plan, passed the next 10 minutes taught her daughter and then her sons and then her nieces and her nephews to read and to write and to play the piano, and she wrote letters to Silas and to Eleanor Mallory and to Prudence Gallagher, the widow from the train, and she read out loud by firelight every evening of every winter for 40 years, and she came in her own quiet way to be the woman the Bitterroot had been waiting for since the November night in 1866 when Margaret Rose Ravenscroft had died alone. And then it was 1908. On a late May afternoon in her 53rd year, Harriet sat in a rocking chair on the long, broad porch of the two-story house that had once been a rough cabin, and she looked out across the meadow where the wildflowers were opening, and she watched her life. The porch was wider now. Gideon and Ezra and Jasper had added to it each spring the way they added to everything, and it wrapped the whole south and east sides of the house like a gallery. The roof of the original cabin was still visible under the taller shingled roof of the additions, preserved carefully the way a man preserves the first thing he ever built with his own hands. A long rope swing hung from the great beam at the south end of the porch, and on that swing, half asleep in the afternoon sun, lay a small girl with pale, wheat-colored hair and a smear of wild strawberry juice on her chin. Beyond the porch, in the deep grass of the yard, 3 children were chasing a border collie. Margaret Rose Ravenscroft, 28 years old, now married these 7 years to a quiet cattleman named Aaron Ballard, had 3 of her own. The oldest, a boy of 6, named after his grandfather, was winning the race against the dog. The middle one, a girl, was losing it. The youngest, the girl on the swing, had decided that chasing was foolish and had gone to sleep instead. At the other end of the porch, in his own rocking chair, an older gentleman sat reading a newspaper through wire-rimmed spectacles. His hair was entirely white. The tips of the last 3 fingers of his left hand were stiff and curled slightly, and he held the paper with his right hand. The old bullet scar through his left eyebrow was a fine silver line, a thing you only noticed if you knew to look. Gideon Ravenscroft was 62 years old. He had slowed down some in the last year, and Harriet watched him each morning with the careful attention of a wife who had always known she would outlast him by a little, and she was glad of every day. He felt her watching. He lowered the paper. His amber eyes found hers over the rim of the spectacles. He did not smile. He never had been much of a man for smiling. But something moved behind the eyes, and a corner of his mouth pulled, and it was more than a smile had ever been. Out in the meadow, a second rocking chair had been set up. In it, wrapped in a blanket, despite the warmth of the day, sat Ezra Ravenscroft, age 60. His chestnut hair had gone to a streaked silver, tied back still, with the same leather cord he had worn at 20. He was whittling. He had not stopped whittling in 40 years. In his lap lay a small wooden horse for the youngest grandchild he had not yet met, the one his youngest son's wife was expecting in September. Prudence sat on a folding camp stool beside him, reading him the day's news from the Helena paper. They had lost their eldest boy 2 years ago to pneumonia, and neither of them would ever be quite whole again. But they were still Ezra and Prudence, still the middle brother and the quiet librarian, and their 4 remaining children were growing into fine, watchful, dark-haired people who wrote letters to them weekly from all over the state. On the far side of the yard, Jasper Ravenscroft, 57 years old and as broad as ever with wheat gold hair, turning to honey gray, was kneeling in the grass with a 10-year-old boy showing him how to brace a rifle against his shoulder. The boy, Jasper's own youngest son, was skinny and bright-eyed and paying close attention. On the porch step, Jasper's wife, Rosalind, sat with a tin cup of coffee in her hand, watching her husband teach their boy, and her black hair was half silver now, and she was still the sharpest tongued woman in Silver Creek County, and Jasper Ravenscroft loved her with every beat of his heart. They had 5 children, 3 boys and 2 girls, all of them thriving. And sitting beside Gideon on the porch in the third rocking chair, long-legged and calm, reading the same newspaper but a different section, was a man of 42 years with the careful gray eyes of his late father and the unmistakable aristocratic line of a long-dead Boston bookkeeper in his jaw. The Honorable Silas Whitlock, judge of the Territorial now State Court of Montana, wore a gray suit and a plain silver watch chain in a pair of dusty riding boots that spoke plainly of a man who rode his circuit on horseback when the trains did not run. He had come up for a week for his nephew's christening and had simply never left yet because his sister's porch had a way of making weeks disappear. He was unmarried, a fact that caused his sister some distress, and that he countered with the observation that his courtrooms took up enough of his heart for now. He lowered his paper. He looked across the porch at Harriet. "Sister," he said in his deep courtroom voice, "you are looking at us all again." "I am," Harriet said. "Is there something in particular that has prompted it?" She smiled. She rocked the chair slowly. The afternoon light was coming long and golden across the valley. The sound of children and dog came up out of the meadow like a small, bright music. "I was just thinking," she said, "that 30 years ago, this fall, I stepped off a stagecoach in Silver Creek with a leather valise and no idea at all of what was going to happen to me." Silas folded his paper carefully. "And what was going to happen to you?" he asked gently, because he had heard her tell this story 100 times, and he was always willing to hear it again. Harriet did not answer right away. She looked at Gideon, then at Ezra out in the meadow, then at Jasper kneeling in the grass with her nephew, then at Margaret Rose shouting laughing instructions at her children, at the small girl on the swing at the green country rolling away toward mountains that had been the edge of the world once and were just the horizon now. "This," she said quietly, "this was going to happen to me." Gideon reached across the space between their rocking chairs, and he took her hand with his scarred right hand, and he held it. They had held hands on this porch in one combination or another of the rocking chairs they had built every afternoon for 30 years, and the gesture was as automatic to them both as breathing. From the porch step at the south end, the small girl on the swing sat up, rubbed her eyes, and looked around. She spotted Harriet. She slid down from the swing and came walking across the boards in her bare feet, solemn as a queen. She climbed up into Harriet's lap without asking and settled herself there with the certainty of a child who has been welcome on every lap in her family since the moment she was born. "Grandmama," she said. "Yes, little one. Mama says you have a story about when you first came to the mountain. She says you met Granddaddy on that day." Gideon beside them made a small, quiet sound in his throat that was not a laugh, but was not far from one. "I do," Harriet said. "I met Granddaddy and your great-uncles Ezra and Jasper on that day." "Will you tell it?" The little girl had strawberry juice at the corner of her mouth and wheat-colored hair coming loose from its braid and her great-grandmother's Irish blue eyes. She looked up at Harriet with the complete attention that only a child of 5 can give, and Harriet Ravenscroft felt time fold itself neatly in her lap like a well-pressed linen napkin. "Once upon a time," she began softly, "there was a young woman in Boston whose father had died. She had a little brother she loved. She had a debt she could not pay. She had 3 choices, and 2 of them would have ruined her. And so she chose the third, and she took a train and a stagecoach, and she rode farther west than she had ever imagined she would go. And one cold afternoon in October, she stepped off that stagecoach into a dirt street in a town called Silver Creek, and she stood in that street with all her earthly belongings in one small leather bag. And she looked up, and there, standing by a freight wagon, were 3 enormous men. Were they scary, Grandmama? Oh, child, the whole town said they were the most dangerous men in Montana. The little girl's eyes went wide. What did you do? Harriet looked down at her great-granddaughter. Then she looked up at Gideon, who was watching her with amber eyes that had never once looked at her without love in 30 years. Then she looked out across the meadow at Ezra in his rocking chair with his wooden horse, and at Jasper kneeling in the grass with a rifle, and at her brother Silas folding his newspapers beside her, and at her daughter chasing dogs through the wildflowers, and at the whole long country of a life she had never in her wildest Boston girlhood imagined she would be given. "What did I do?" she said. "I stayed, little one." She pressed a kiss to the top of the child's wheat-colored head. "I stayed, and that was the day my life began." The little girl was quiet for a moment, considering this. Then she leaned back against her grandmother's chest and looked out at the Golden Valley. "That is a good story, Grandmama," she said. "It is the best story I know," Harriet answered. The sun settled lower. The meadow went from gold to deeper gold. A pair of crows lifted from the pines behind the house and called to each other, and far up on the ridge, under the great lodgepole pine, where Silas Ravenscroft had carved his wife's name. In 1853, the four stones stood quietly in the lengthening light, Margaret Rose and Silas and Eleanor Marie, and since 1901, a small polished stone that read simply, Eleanor Mallory, beloved sister, Denver, Colorado. And on the wide porch of the house he had built, Gideon Ravenscroft held his wife's hand, and she held their great-granddaughter on her lap. And the Bitterroot ridges stood blue and eternal beyond the meadow. And that, as any Ravenscroft man would tell you, and as any Ravenscroft woman now would tell you, just as plainly was worth any price the mountain had ever asked. And a little wind came down from the high country, and it moved through the grass, and it sounded almost like a voice, Irish and warm, saying, "Well done. Well done, all of you. Come home to supper when you are ready." They were.